Chapter 1494. It seems that more than half of the sages in the universe are disciples of the sages, right? Luo Fan sighed. But it's not that exaggerated. Hun Guzi smiled. Becoming a sage, whether it's becoming a true sage or a false sage, is not a simple matter. Even if one is a disciple of a sage, the chances of becoming a false sage are extremely low. It's already considered extremely lucky if 1 in 10,000 people can succeed. Therefore, among the tens of thousands of sages in the universe, there are less than 100 who are disciples of a sage. Luo Fan came to a realization and heaved a sigh of relief. Although it was already an exaggeration to say that 100 sages were disciples of the sages, the situation was clearly much better than thousands of disciples of the sages. His mentality seemed to have no reason, but it was actually a very natural mentality. If there were thousands of false sages under the sages, it might not seem to affect him much, but as long as he thought about it carefully, he would know how great the impact was. There were so many disciples of a sage, but he didn't discover a single one. What kind of concept was this? What kind of setback was this for him? Why did you hide in the great Tao fragment? I think with your ability, it's impossible for you to fail in the war of heaven and earth, right? Luo Fan asked with a smile. Hun Guzi also smiled and said, "There's no other reason. I just want to transcend the shackles of heaven and earth and get as close to a true sage as possible." Luo Fan looked at the great Tao that was like a mist behind him and came to a realization. With this great Tao, Hun Guzi was indeed able to unleash the power of a false sage anywhere in the Earth universe. Although this was still quite a distance away from a true sage compared to other false sages. In fact, compared to other pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, this was already many times better. If Hun Guzi had set up so many schemes for this goal, or even faked his death to hide in the great Tao fragment, it was indeed possible. However, of course, this couldn't be the whole truth. If it was just for this result, why would he wait until he was found by Luo Fan just now? Back then, when the great Tao shattered, he could have collected as many fragments as possible. He broke free and gained his freedom. Therefore, it was obvious. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why Hun Guzi made such a choice. But it was absolutely not the only reason. He must have a deeper plan, and he must have even more ideas. This was what Luo Fan wanted to know. Now, he had already participated in the battle between the saints across the universe, so it was extremely difficult for him to escape. Under such circumstances, how could he not find out the reason behind Hun Guzi's sudden change that was completely out of his control? One must know that this was an accident. This was a war that was enough to doom his incarnation beyond redemption and destroy the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure he had painstakingly refined. Therefore, even though Luo Fan knew that Hun Guzi still had more things to hide, he didn't let them go. He immediately asked, "Fellow Taoist schemes are profound. I can't guess. However, I hope fellow Taoists can forgive me. I have to ask clearly, so I hope fellow Taoists can tell me." Hun Guzi smiled when he heard this. "I do have some ideas. However, I can't reveal them so casually." Luo Fan frowned. "Then how can I find out about fellow Taoist schemes?" The smile on Hun Guzi's face remained unchanged. "At the very least, you must let me know that fellow Taoist has the qualifications to do so." "I see. It seems that my previous plan of avoiding a fight was too naive." Luo Fan sighed. For cultivators, things like qualifications were obviously brought about by strength. If one wanted to see what qualifications one had, it was obviously to see what kind of strength Luo Fan possessed. Obviously, in order to complete this step, he had to go through a battle. After Luo Fan finished speaking, he didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. In an instant, a mysterious net of karma suddenly appeared. It covered the infinite world, countless space-times, and even wrapped around the long river of luck. In an instant, it covered everything that could be seen with the naked eye, and even everything that could be sensed, including all space-times. This was the sage theurgy that he had obtained. It was the true sage ability that had allowed the bolder saint to become a sage again. It was the true sage ability that gave him the confidence to fight sage Zhan Hui even without the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. This true sage sacred art was fundamentally different from those false sage sacred arts. Once it appeared, it naturally broke through the shackles of this world and directly swept through countless vast thousand worlds. Even other worlds with saints were affected by this magical power and enveloped by the power of this magical power. Under the wrapping of the net of karma, all of Hun Guzi's connections with the river of luck were instantly bound. There were various mysterious and bizarre powers that continuously seeped in two directions through this connection. One direction was naturally the world of luck that belonged to Hun Guzi in the river of luck, while the other direction was where Hun Guzi's body was. Hun Guzi's expression changed drastically when he saw that Luo Fan had actually used this true sage ability. A true sage's magical power was not a false sage's magical power that was cut corners. It was a magical power created by a real sage, and it contained the mysteries of a real sage's Tao. The power of this ability was more than 100 times stronger than those pseudo-sage abilities. As a disciple of a sage, he had only been taught 3 true sage abilities by the ancestor of primordial chaos after he became a pseudo-sage. And now, this existence that was clearly not a pseudo-sage when he left the main world had actually also mastered a true sage ability. How subversive was this? Even though he had the temperament of a sage, he couldn't help but feel shocked. However, he was a disciple of a sage after all, and he was even a pseudo-sage. When the power of the net of karma swept up and down, he raised his hand and pointed at the void. Naturally, a ray of spiritual light rushed out from his hand. This ray of spiritual light was completely different from all the spiritual lights that Luo Fan had seen in the past, including the spiritual lights from the hands of other pseudo-sages and the spiritual lights from pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. Its mysteriousness and profoundness were not something that those spiritual lights could compare to. Other spiritual lights might be pure. Perhaps they were all-encompassing. Perhaps there were endless worlds within them. However, there had never been a ray of spiritual light that possessed the rich Tao of a sage. This Tao of a sage, it was so strong that it made Luo Fan feel as if he had seen a real sage. It was not a pseudo-sage, but a true sage who could move freely in the state of chaos and was not restrained by any shackles of the world. He could easily create a perfect world, such as spiritual light's true form. Even Luo Fan could not see through it clearly. In his perception, this divine light seemed to contain countless characteristics at the same time, even if they were mutually contradictory characteristics. It seemed to be extremely pure, but it also seemed to be all-encompassing and had endless worlds within it. It also seemed to have billions of extremely pure characteristics appearing on it at the same time. It was like, whatever he thought, the spiritual light would be like that. His heart changed billions of times in an instant, and the nature of the spiritual light also changed billions of times. Moreover, every change was done to the extreme. It displayed the characteristics that Luo Fan had seen to the extreme. This was a true sage ability. Even if Luo Fan had already grasped a true divine magical ability, it was still impossible for him to completely understand its mysteries and truly grasp its principles. Of course, in Luo Fan's eyes, this spiritual light was just like that. However, in Hun Guzi's eyes, the karma net that he had displayed was obviously similar. This karma net was just a karma net in Luo Fan's eyes, but in Hun Guzi's eyes, it was a kind of infinitely mysterious net-like object. In that net-like object, he could also sense a feeling similar to what Luo Fan was feeling at this time. It seemed to contain endless characteristics, as if there were hundreds of millions of completely incompatible, completely contradictory, and completely opposite characteristics contained in it at the same time. These feelings seemed incredible, but they were actually the characteristics of a true sage ability. Unless one became a true sage, the mysteries of the sage Tao contained in a true sage ability would be something that was completely incomprehensible and unimaginable to them. Even if one had personally witnessed the entire process of its birth, Even if the divine ability had already taken effect on its body, unless one had become a true saint, one would definitely not know what the divine ability was used for or how it worked. Such characteristics had led to the current situation at this moment. Although both of them had mastered a true sage ability and were clear about the magical effects of their own true sage ability, they could only see the mysteries of their opponent's ability. They could only feel that it was mysterious and profound, but it was impossible for them to clearly see all the mysteries within it. A true sage ability was naturally different from ordinary ability. It contained a profound and unfathomable spirituality. It could even be comparable to a sage's spirituality. After it was unleashed, it would naturally be able to carry out the will of the user, naturally adjusting the explosive power and changing the way it was used. Just like at this moment, even Hun Guzi didn't know how Luo Fan's net of karma was produced or how to deal with him. However, the ray of spiritual light that he released would naturally respond to the way the net of karma worked. In an instant, the ray of spiritual light suddenly poured into the inexplicable connection between Hun Guzi and his Luck Dao River. It directly followed this connection to meet the net of karma that Luo Fan had released. At this moment, the net of karma sensed the attack of the ray of spiritual light and instantly analyzed the direction and effect of the ray of spiritual light. With a slight tremble, countless karma appeared out of thin air and directly entangled the ray of spiritual light. If any one of these countless karma were released, it would be enough to consign any part of the world to eternal damnation. However, at this moment, when the trillions of karma fused together to face the saint's ability, there was no effect at all. The ray of light also responded in an instant. With a slight turn, a destructive power that was completely targeted at the karma burst forth, directly breaking the trillions of karma. It turned the billions of karma invisible. Then, the net of karma adjusted its method again. Endless karma level attacks surged towards the ray of spiritual light, attacking all traces of the ray of spiritual light in the karma level. It wanted to completely erase the ray of spiritual light from this level. However, the ray of spiritual light was also a true divine ability. It naturally wouldn't have no reaction. Following the power of the net of karma, it directly broke into the karma level and completely targeted the power of the attack. It completely enveloped the attack, turning it invisible in the blink of an eye. It even counterattacked and rushed towards the net of karma through the karma level, and so on. In the blink of an eye, the two true divine remarkable powers had already exchanged billions of trillions of power transformations. Layers of saint-level treasure light began to explode from the point of contact between the two. Luo Fan's pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure divine court heavenly cauldron seemed to have become transparent glass at this moment. It couldn't block the saint-level treasure light at all. The treasure light rushed out in an instant and swept towards the place where Luo Fan was located that could give birth to sages. Fortunately, this kind of treasure light was just pure treasure light. Although it had the characteristics of a saint-level treasure, it didn't contain its power. Although it swept through endless places, it didn't cause any impact. However, it only made all living beings in this world feel an incomparably pure feeling during this process. Being shrouded by the light that belonged to a sage, it naturally produced an invisible shock and awe. Even at this stage, the treasure light didn't stop. Instead, it continued to penetrate out. In the blink of an eye, it had already penetrated out of this world. And in the blink of an eye, it had completely enveloped this sage battlefield. Although this kind of treasure light wasn't much stronger than the treasure light emitted by many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, it was many times purer. The essence and aura of a sage contained within it was also many times purer. However, in an instant, it made the many sages who were fighting stop their movements. The entire battlefield fell silent. Once the treasure light appeared, it surged out layer by layer, constantly spreading and spreading. In the end, it was powerless to continue until it almost touched another battlefield. This is the light of a true sage. In an instant, Many false sages present had this inexplicable realization in their hearts. As false sages, they couldn't be more clear about the light, aura, and abilities of a false sage. Their original indifference, their original demeanor of having everything under control, was also because all the actions, powers, and attitudes of the other saints were all within their expectations and within the scope of their understanding. Now that they suddenly discovered that there was a treasure light that was beyond their understanding, they were all stirred up by emotions that they hadn't felt for many years. Inexplicable doubts and shock lingered in their hearts. At the false sage level, they had long become indifferent to all hatred. As long as there was a relationship of interest between them, they could let go of any hatred no matter how great it was. At this moment, with the appearance of this light that was beyond their understanding, their original hostility was naturally dispelled. At this moment, all of the false sages had the idea of exploring the root of this light. At this moment, Luo Fan and Han Guzi didn't have the time to care about the changes outside. At this moment, the two of them stared at each other with solemn expressions. The true sage abilities that the two of them had unleashed were constantly evolving in the void with all sorts of changes that the two of them couldn't understand, displaying the deeper mysteries of the true sage abilities. I didn't expect the true sage abilities to be so mysterious. No wonder the false sages can't resist a true sage at all. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Although false sages were said to be not much different from true sages in the world, and had almost all the power and abilities of a true sage in the world. However, that was only the effect of controlling the world and all living beings. It didn't mean that they could really fight to a draw with a true sage in the world. Initially, Luo Fan didn't quite understand, but after witnessing the power of the true sage abilities, he already understood. For any false sage, a true sage didn't need any special methods. They only needed to unleash a true sage ability, and the false sage wouldn't be able to resist at all. This was because the true sage ability would naturally adjust its attack according to the false sage's response. It would naturally adjust its attacks according to all the responses of the false saint. In the end, it would definitely evolve into an attack that the false saint could not resist and easily crush the false saint. It's a pity that I haven't really tested this ability before, so I haven't completely grasped all its changes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made such a mistake now. Luo Fan sighed in his heart. Now, the two true saint divine abilities had already collided, and even he and Han Guzi couldn't separate them. They had to wait for one of the two divine abilities to emerge victorious. Only then would they be able to stop. This was different from what he and Han Guzi had thought before. It was obviously a mistake. I should have tested the power of the true sage ability first. Han Guzi sighed. This sigh was very similar to the one Luo Fan was sighing in his heart. Hearing this, Luo Fan looked over. He saw a bitter expression on Han Guzi's face. Obviously, he was like Luo Fan. Ever since he cultivated this true sage ability, he had never used it against an enemy. He had never truly seen the full power of this divine ability. It was precisely because of this that he did not hesitate to use the true Saint Mystic ability just now. This time, I've implicated you, fellow Taoist, Han Guzi suddenly said. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. Why do you say that, fellow Taoist? Han Guzi shook his head and sighed. Seeing him like this, Luo Fan was shocked. He sensed slightly and instantly understood what it was like outside the divine court's heavenly cauldron. He couldn't help but look bitter. So many sages had stopped fighting and looked over to him. Even the Genesis sage and the others had locked their gazes on him. The situation was really bad to the point that it couldn't be helped. He asked himself if he was a false sage and had painstakingly pursued becoming a true sage but was unable to do so, and suddenly saw a treasure light that belonged to a true sage, he would definitely give everything he had to dig out the source of this treasure light. He would definitely do everything he could to grasp all the mysteries within it. If he was like this, the other sages would obviously not be an exception. Therefore, it could be said that when the sages discovered the treasure light, Luo Fan and Han Guzi had already become the target of everyone. They had become a box filled with the secrets that all the sages wanted to obtain. It was almost certain that he would be standing opposite all the sages from now on. So that's the case. I didn't expect things to develop to this point. Luo Fan could only sigh at this time. What else could he do? Although Han Guzi said that this matter was his fault, was it really his fault? If Luo Fan hadn't used a true sage theurgy to attack him, how could Han Guzi have used a true sage theurgy to block it? Since he didn't use a true sage theurgy to block it, it was naturally impossible for the two true sage theurgy to trigger each other. Naturally, it was impossible for the layers of treasure light to spread out and be noticed by all the sages. Of course, this didn't mean that he was responsible for everything. It could only be said that both sides were responsible, and no one could blame the other. After sighing, Luo Fan smiled bitterly at Han Guzi and said, I didn't expect fellow Taoists to never use a true sage theurgy against an enemy nation after mastering it for so many years. That's not it. I've used a true sage theurgy against an enemy before. It's just that my opponent didn't need to use this theurgy to unleash much of its power. He easily dealt with it with tens of thousands of variations. I didn't expect that when two true sage theurgy met, there would be such a change. It's also because our realms aren't high enough to completely master a true sage theurgy. Otherwise, things wouldn't have developed to this point. Han Guzi also smiled bitterly. Fortunately, it's a true sage theurgy and its power is extremely restrained, so it doesn't leak out at all. Otherwise, if this continues, I'm afraid all the worlds in the universe will be destroyed by them. At that time, I'm afraid we'll really become the public enemy of all the sages. Luo Fan sighed. Chapter 1495. It's about time now. Han Guzi sighed. Luo Fan also sighed when he heard that. The two true sage sacred arts were now completely entangled with each other. Even if the two of them were to join forces, they would not be able to resist. Even though the two of them had joined forces, it was still difficult to separate them completely. They could only let them attack each other in this world until the small difference between them was magnified enough for one side to suppress the other. However, although the result was somewhat out of their expectations, at least they had achieved their main goal of triggering the battle. Han Guzi should have truly realized the extent of Luo Fan's strength and understood that Luo Fan was qualified to explore his secrets. I wonder if fellow Taoist can tell me everything I want to know now. Luo Fan smiled. Of course. However, I'm afraid this isn't the time to talk about this, Han Guzi said indifferently. Luo Fan's mind was clear, so he naturally knew what Han Guzi was referring to. He smiled and said, although the timing isn't perfect, it's still a suitable one. Han Guzi laughed when he heard that. Indeed, although the surrounding sages were staring at him covetously, it seemed extremely dangerous. However, both of them had grasped the true Saint Theurgis. As long as those false sages hadn't grasped the true Saint Theurgis, they wouldn't be able to resist their Theurgis. No matter how powerful they were or how mysterious their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures were, they wouldn't be able to change this outcome. The difference in these circumstances would only affect the final outcome by how much longer it would be delayed with such confidence. Although the current situation seemed extremely dangerous, it really wasn't much of a threat to them. Then, may I know why fellow Taoist made this choice? Luo Fan asked. It seems complicated if I don't explain it clearly. However, if I explain it clearly, fellow Taoist will feel that things are actually that simple, Han Guzi said. I'd like to hear the details. Hiding your body and mind among the great Tao fragments is to control the world formed by the fusion of many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. This world was formed from thousands of pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. Although the great Taos contained within were inferior to those of the main world, they were still at least 1% as powerful. If he could control that world and become a saint within it, he would have a chance to grasp the path of a true saint and become a true saint. This is my plan. This is also the plan of many other fellow Taoists, Han Guzi said. Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood. Indeed, after hearing Hun Guzi's words, he suddenly realized something. It turned out that things were that simple. To hide one's body and mind in the great Tao fragment, this seemed to be the only way. However, there were still some suspicious points. Therefore, he asked, although the world formed by the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures is powerful, there is still a huge difference between it and the main world in essence. He would only become a slightly stronger false sage. Why are you so confident that you could become a true sage in there? Although Hun Guzi had only said a few, it was still a saint. These few points were already a huge opportunity that was almost heaven-defying. It was almost equivalent to 100% of other things. This is my master's guidance, Hun Guzi said lightly. Hearing this, Luo Fan's body and mind shook. A look of disbelief appeared in his eyes, and he almost instinctively said, "Impossible." Who was Hun Guzi's master? He was a true saint, the ancestor of primordial chaos. This kind of existence had profound wisdom and far-reaching calculations that were beyond his imagination. The limit. No one dared to ignore the words of such an existence, not even Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan knew very well that it was absolutely impossible to become a true sage in the newly formed world using the method of becoming a false sage. This fact made him lose his composure for an instant. Hearing this, Hun Guzi looked at Luo Fan with an inexplicable gaze. "Why is it impossible?" he said with a faint smile. If the sages felt that this matter could be successful, why didn't they condense the great ways of heaven and earth and directly create the heaven and earth? Wouldn't they have been able to cultivate more true sages earlier? Why do they have to wait until now, when we have to go through a tough war to complete it? You should know that for a venerable sage, it would only take a single thought to achieve all of this. Luo Fan said as he found a reason to do so. Hun Guzi laughed and said, "Fellow Taoist, you've lost your composure. The thoughts of a venerable sage is a domain that we can't explore. Why do you want to guess the thoughts of a venerable sage?" Hearing this, Luo Fan was speechless. The rebuttal of these words was strong enough to negate all doubts, and it was enough to prevent anyone from raising any more effective objections. A venerable sage represented omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience. The schemes of such an existence were indeed not something that he could understand. Left with no choice, Luo Fan could only let go of this matter. The words of a true sage were very powerful. Even though Luo Fan already had a conclusion in his heart, he couldn't help but want to enter that world to see what was going on. He wanted to understand why a venerable sage would say such words. Of course, this didn't mean that he was willing to give up on his own, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. Right now, his true cultivation realm was only that of a level 8 false sage. He wasn't even a level 9 false sage or a supreme venerable, let alone a false sage. The reason why he could possess the power of a sage that was close to omnipotent and was able to cast the supernatural powers of a sage so easily was not only because he had the supreme authority of this world, but also because he had a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure like the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. If he lost the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, how would he be qualified to participate in the war between sages? How would he be qualified to step into the world that would be united in the future? Perhaps I should think of a way to truly combine the heavenly cauldron of the divine court with my incarnation. This thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Although the heavenly cauldron of the divine court was his magic treasure, it had his deepest origin imprint in it. However, after all, it wasn't completely one with him, so there was still a slight possibility that it could be taken away. In this case, if he used the power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to resist other false sages, that would be a huge flaw. Under normal circumstances, this kind of flaw would not be enough for those false saints to exhaust their energy to plot against him before there was any irreconcilable hatred. However, if there was a day when the world formed by many pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures was formed and he still wandered around with this pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasure, it would obviously incur the wrath of the masses. It would cause many false saints to place their attention on him, and plot against him. They would think of a way to snatch the heavenly cauldron of the divine court away. Only when he completely fused the heavenly cauldron of the divine court with him and turned it into his incarnation's body would it truly become inseparable. If they wanted to snatch the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, they would have to kill him. Only then would he be able to protect the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. Not only that, if the other false sages wanted to snatch the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, they would not rest until he was dead. They would have scruples in their hearts. Because of this, he used the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to execute his true sage mystical ability. There would no longer be any flaws. Let him. It would be enough to perfectly protect the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. And himself, of course, although he had such a thought. However, it was obvious that he could not take action at this time. After all, it was not an easy task to completely refine a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure into his body. However, it was impossible for it to end in a short period of time. He could only spend a long time and exhaust endless energy. Only then would there be a chance of success. Hun Guzi was still standing in front of him, so it was obviously not a good opportunity for him to do so. After making up his mind, Luo Fan said to Hun Guzi, "What do you plan to do next?" He believed that Hun Guzi knew what he meant. From the looks of it, it was impossible for Hun Guzi's previous plan to succeed. With the light of a true sage appearing, how could the other false sages put more attention on the future or even the insignificant hope of becoming a true sage? Naturally, they would place all their attention here, on the two of them. The war would naturally stop. As such, Hun Guzi planned to continue waiting. At the final moment of the world's formation, it was naturally impossible for him to completely control it. Hearing this, Hun Guzi smiled and said, "Since we can't wait, we can only take the initiative to attack." As he said this, he turned his gaze around. His eyes pierced through the barrier of the world and shone directly on the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. Seeing his expression and the look in his eyes, Luo Fan was taken aback and hurriedly said, "Don't set your sights on my Dharma treasure. I won't give up on this Dharma treasure, no matter what." Hun Guzi's expression did not change, but there was a trace of pity in his eyes. From the looks of it, he had really set his sights on Luo Fan's heavenly cauldron. He planned to use the destruction of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to warn the other sages. If it was someone else, even if they said this, Hun Guzi would only pretend that he did not hear it. But now, the true sage theurgy that Luo Fan had released was entangled with the true sage theurgy that he had released. The sage-level treasure light spread out layer by layer, penetrating the world, the Dharma treasure, and the outside world, directly illuminating an unknown area of nothingness. The powerful strength that was reflected in it belonged to Luo Fan, so he could only listen to Luo Fan's words and divert his attention. Seeing him like this, Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. Fortunately, he stopped it quickly. Otherwise, the battle between the true sage theurgy would probably happen again. Hun Guzi sighed and said to Luo Fan, "Since you can't bear to part with it, then forget it. It's just a pity that if you are willing to part with this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, when the world is formed in the future, you will definitely be able to obtain a lot of authority in it. You might even be able to obtain supreme authority like what you have now in this world." "Forget it." Luo Fan just shook his head. This supreme authority was only a choice he made because he had no other choice. It was because he could only rely on this to be equal to a false sage. That was why he held it in his hands. If he could obtain such a theurgy without the help of supreme authority, he would be able to be on par with a false sage. Why would he still care about this supreme authority? How could he use another thing that could give him such an ability in exchange for this supreme authority? Not to mention, what Hun Guzi said was only a possibility. It was not certain that he would obtain the supreme authority. In the end, he might even only obtain a small amount of authority. It was even more impossible for him to give up the heavenly cauldron in exchange for such authority. Hun Guzi did not dwell on it, but his expression was full of pity. It was as if he really felt sorry for Luo Fan's choice. After shaking his head and sighing, He got up and took a light step forward. His figure directly left this world in the heavenly cauldron. Under the situation where Luo Fan did not stop him, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court instinctively tried to stop him. However, it could not affect a false saint, especially when this false saint was proficient in the true divine mystical ability. After leaving the heavenly cauldron, the Genesis sage and the others instantly discovered Hun Guzi's existence. All of a sudden, countless thoughts flashed through the minds of the sages. In the blink of an eye, they had come up with countless guesses. However, no matter how they thought about it, they could not let Hun Guzi leave just like that. In an instant, the power of the sages appeared around Hun Guzi, directly turning this place into a strange, chaotic state. Following this change, the figures of the sages appeared. They appeared in front of Hun Guzi. They faced him from afar. "May I know your name?" The Genesis sage asked sternly. Facing things that he could not understand, the Genesis sage could no longer be indifferent like before, as if everything was under his control. "You can call me Hun Guzi." "Hun Guzi," Hun Guzi said indifferently. "Hun Guzi? It seems like you're not an ordinary false sage." The Genesis sage instantly made a judgment. "You can say that. However, I want to explain. If you understand, then you understand. If you don't understand, then you don't understand." Hun Guzi smiled. At this moment, Luo Fan opened his eyes. He had retracted his projection and returned his consciousness to his body. After his consciousness returned, he raised his hand and pointed at the heavenly cauldron. In an instant, layers of true divine treasure light shot out of the mouth of the divine court heavenly cauldron. As this world left the heavenly cauldron, the three-legged cauldron instantly returned to its original appearance. It looked like an extremely ordinary cauldron. During the process of the two true sage theurgies fighting in that world, their power was restrained and did not cause much damage to the world, let alone his heavenly cauldron. However, the treasure light that burst out was almost unstoppable. It penetrated through layers of obstacles and shot into the depths of the void. As a result, the place where these two theurgies existed was like the most conspicuous thing in the world. No matter how hard it tried to hide, it was as obvious as a lighthouse. This was obviously unacceptable to Luo Fan. Therefore, the only choice he could make was to abandon the world where the two true sage theurgies were fighting and throw it out of the heavenly cauldron. After all, it was just a vast thousand realms. To Luo Fan and the heavenly cauldron, they could create countless existences with just a thought. It was not a pity to abandon it. The appearance of this world instantly made the eyes of the Genesis sage and the others shine with endless brilliance. It was a strong sense of possessiveness. Apart from the Genesis sage, the other sages felt the same way. To Luo Fan and Hun Guzi, these were just two theurgies that they had cast. Although they were extremely mysterious, they could cast them again at any time, so they naturally did not care about these two theurgies. However, to the Genesis sage and the others, these were the only existences that were related to true sages that they could come into contact with. To them, who were determined to turn fake into real and become true sages, this was like a ray of light that appeared out of nowhere in the darkness. It was the only straw in the abyss. One could imagine how much they cared about these two theurgies. Hun Guzi could not help but smile when he saw the expressions of the sages, but he did not say anything. At this moment, the Genesis sage made his move. He suddenly raised his hand and grabbed at the vast thousand realms that Luo Fan had thrown out. With this grab, he had unleashed his strongest false sage ability, but it seemed so mysterious and profound. The entire world seemed to have started to spin under this grab of his. Endless mysterious power was added to it, causing the great thousand world to gradually shrink until it became a small ball. The pill, which was emitting layers upon layers of treasured light, fell into his hand. During this process, whether it was Luo Fan, Hun Guzi, or the other false sages, none of them stopped him. They quietly waited for the Genesis sage to compress the vast thousand realms and put them away. The reason why Luo Fan and Hun Guzi did not make a move was simple. They did not think that the vast thousand realms was important to them. They did not think that the vast thousand realms and the battle between the two theurgies inside would bring them any benefits. The other sages did not make a move. This was because they believed that even if the Genesis sage obtained this item, he would only share it with them and would not keep it for himself. As a result, there was not much difference between the Genesis sage putting it away and them putting it away themselves. From this, it could be seen how much prestige the Genesis sage had among the sages. Hunguzi suddenly smiled. I have a piece of advice. The Genesis sage was taken aback. What advice do you have for me? You. It's best not to pour any of your power into that world, Hunguzi said. The Genesis sage frowned. What else can I do? You can give it a try. Hunguzi did not explain further and only smiled faintly. Hunguzi said, this kind of behavior was obviously very hateful. If there was an impulsive person, they might deliberately pour their power into the vast thousand realms out of impulse. It was time to see what was going on. However, it was obvious that anyone who could become a sage would not be someone who would lose their rationality when they were impulsive. Although he was unhappy that Hunguzi didn't explain clearly, the Genesis saint still knew what was going on and stopped what he was about to do to observe what was happening in the Great Thousand World. However, after going through so much trouble to obtain this vast thousand realms, the Genesis sage obviously could not just put it away without doing anything. His mind stirred, and he directly sent the boundless universe out of this world. In other words, this flying sword directly arrived at his pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure and instantly began to fuse with it to a certain degree. As the vast thousand realms fused with his pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, layers of true sage treasure light surged out from the vast thousand realms and directly wrapped around the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, making it seem as if the treasure light was emitted by the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. At this moment, the eyes of the many sages who were watching this scene lit up. Many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures instantly erupted with astonishing power and concentrated their attacks on the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure of the Genesis sage. As pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures, the attacks they sent out were naturally incomparably mysterious. Every single one of them had a different situation, and every single one of them contained some profound and unfathomable truth. The moment these attacks gathered together, it was as if the endless world was about to be annihilated. The pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure was instantly submerged. If this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure was under normal circumstances, even if it did not shatter under such attacks, it would definitely be severely damaged. However, at this time, the Genesis saint directly used some incomparably mysterious method to directly absorb the attacks of the pseudo-primordial epic spirit treasures that he had just sent to the Great Thousand World within the pseudo-primordial epic spirit treasures. In that instant, the attacks that were originally strong enough to completely crush the vast thousand realms, completely erasing everything, all power, and all existence within it, actually poured into the vast thousand realms without any reservation. Moreover, it did not cause the slightest bit of damage to the vast thousand realms. It was as if the things that poured into it were just ordinary light and shadows. At most, it was very ordinary power, and it did not seem like the attacks of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures at all. This strange scene caused even the Genesis sage's expression to change greatly, let alone the many people controlling the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to attack. For a moment, endless vigilance surged in the hearts of every pseudo-sage, and they instinctively began to activate the powerful defensive power contained in their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Chapter 1496. Pure Text Online Reading Website. Domain name. Font color equals red. Squinting eyes face. B. Mobile phone synchronization. Please visit at that moment. Two types of light rushed out of the colossal world. Each of these two types of light exuded a supreme, eternal, and indestructible aura. Under these two types of light, everything in the universe seemed to have become illusory. It was as if only these two types of light were real in the entire universe. Under this light, even the many false sages felt their hearts tremble. They felt as if they had become mortals and were facing supreme power. The surrounding layers of treasure light were completely attached to these two types of light at this moment. The pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures seemed to have been frozen in the void at this moment. Their originally boundless and terrifying power seemed to have completely disappeared at this moment. They looked like extremely ordinary things with nothing special about them. The two rays of light directly drowned the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. All kinds of incredible and powerful attacks erupted in an instant and pounced on the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. They were triggered on the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures one by one, constantly shaking them. At this moment, the many false sages seemed to have woken up from a dream. Immediately, they frantically activated their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, trying their best to stimulate the power of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. They used all the means they could to resist the terrifying attacks of these two types of light. After all, they were pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, although they were facing attacks that they didn't understand and couldn't control. However, its great power allowed it to block the two rays of light to a certain extent. For a moment, there were only bursts of spiritual light. All kinds of unpredictable defenses appeared on the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, enveloping them. They surged with the surrounding light and erupted with countless astonishing and terrifying fluctuations. The two rays of light were obviously the attacks of the two true sage mystiques that Luo Fan and Henguzhi had launched. After these two true sage mystiques left the hands of Luo Fan and Henguzhi, they had almost become two true sages who only had combat instincts. Their intellect was limited because they were only a single divine ability. He could not have all kinds of complicated thoughts like a real sage. However, as a true divine theurgy's dignity. But they all had it. When they attacked each other, they could naturally control their power to not affect the things around them. However, how could they not be bothered by the stimulation of external forces? Just as the attacks from the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures entered the boundless world and swept across the two true divine mystic arts, the spiritual wisdom of these two true divine remarkable powers was instantly triggered. Immediately, through countless changes, they eliminated the attacks of the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. Then, they followed the source of these attacks and counterattacked. They split off a bit of their power to completely wrap up the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. He had to completely destroy these pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. Even though it was only a small portion, once one reached the level of a true sage sacred art, the ability to generate energy on its own was already the most basic ability. This bit of power quickly grew billions of times, to the point where it could completely envelop a vast area of nothingness. It completely enveloped the entire battlefield and all the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. Of course, after all, they did not understand complicated human emotions. These two true divine remarkable powers did not use the aura of the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to trace back up and find the owners of these pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, which was the fake sages hidden between the heavens and the earth. However, they only treated those pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures as their opponents. This was a matter of course. If these two true divine remarkable powers could trace back up, how could they still fight to the death with the other party? They would have bypassed the other party long ago. They would have attacked Luo Fan and Henguzhi. The pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were extremely powerful. Each of them was equivalent to a fake sage. Even if their effects were different, they were just focused on different things. They could almost be said to be omnipotent. However, such pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were not real primordial essence spirit treasures after all. There were definitely all kinds of flaws in them. The most obvious one was that the source of their power came from the great Tao fragments and not from their own power. To the two true divine, remarkable powers that were ever-changing and could find any kind of attack method to deal with their opponents, this was like an open door waiting for them to attack. Although they resisted with difficulty, the defensive circle was constantly compressed by the two rays of light, and the strength of the defense was constantly reduced. Finally, before long, all sorts of damage began to appear on these pseudo-primordial spirit treasures. Traces of destruction began to appear on the surface of these pseudo-primordial spirit treasures, even penetrating deep into them, causing them to totter on the verge of collapse. How powerful! At this moment, the initiator of all this, the Genesis sage, was already trembling. He could no longer maintain his calm expression, and his eyes were filled with an inexplicable sense of awe. He had originally thought that there would be some changes, such as the vast thousand worlds being undamaged or some kind of power being reflected. However, he had never thought that such a situation would occur. The hundreds of pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures and the hundreds of fake sages were actually in such a sorry state because of the reflected power. Moreover, it seemed like the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were still on the verge of being destroyed. This situation was really beyond the limits of what he could accept. The Genesis sage had proven his Tao and become a sage for the longest time in this world. It was also considered early in the myriad of worlds. From the moment he became a fake sage until now, it had been countless trillions of years. Even though he knew that he was only a fake sage, even though he knew that there were real sages above him who could easily crush him, he had been supreme for countless years. No one could suppress him, and not many people could stand beside him. His mentality had already completely adapted to this situation. He almost thought that there was no power in the countless worlds that could surpass him. Nothing would be beyond his understanding. Under such circumstances, he suddenly encountered such an encounter at this moment. He suddenly realized that with two true saint divine abilities, he could actually achieve such a feat by just relying on the reverse stimulation of his energy. He could easily annihilate so many people who were at the same level as him. That mentality of suddenly turning into an ant made him a little flustered, and he had almost forgotten how to deal with it. However, the Genesis sage was the Genesis sage, after all. He was someone who could open up the path of becoming a fake sage when there were no sages in the world. How could he be a simple person? The mentality that had been accumulated for countless trillions of years was actually changed very quickly. Although it was still a little awkward, he still found the attitude and method to deal with this situation. He raised his hand and waved, retrieving his pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. He then kept the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure that looked like a lamp in front of him. At this moment, that great thousand world was within the light of this lamp, and the boundless treasured light it emitted was like the boundless light emitted by this lamp. This appearance seemed to be surprisingly compatible. It was as if the vast thousand worlds were born on this lamp and not added to it later. This was actually not strange. Whether it was the Genesis sage or other sages, it did not matter if his treasure was this lamp or something else. In the end, when the vast thousand worlds were integrated into it, it would definitely not feel out of place. It seemed extremely natural, as if the vast thousand worlds were originally here, and it was originally a part of this treasure. After all, a sage was a sage. Every action of theirs was in line with some inexplicable mystery. The act of adding the vast thousand worlds to the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure was originally a kind of treasure refining process in a broad sense, and it naturally matched the characteristics of sages refining treasures. Of course, it seemed incomparably perfect. Looking at this oil lamp, the Genesis sage directly plucked the lamp flower from the lamp. In an instant, the oil lamp had completely returned to its original state. It looked very ordinary, very ordinary. In his hand, the crystal ball that seemed to be emitting layers of endless treasure light appeared again. At this moment, he already felt that this vast thousand worlds was a little troublesome. The previous performance of this vast thousand worlds was enough to show how powerful it was, and it was enough to show how precious it was. However, it was also because of this that this vast thousand worlds had become even more sought after. If he were to retain this major chiliocosm, he would definitely become the target of public criticism. He would become the target of many false sages. However, even if he understood that this was the case with this vast thousand worlds, he could not just give up on this vast thousand worlds. After all, this was related to a true sage. Compared to other things, it was more reliable to comprehend the method of turning the false into the true from it. After a while, the Genesis sage sighed and said, "I wonder what fellow Taoist wants to achieve." He was naturally asking about Hongouzi. Seeing that he was being so tactful, Hongouzi smiled and said, "I want enough great Tao fragments." The Genesis sage had already expected this, so he was not surprised. He only felt a little regretful. He lifted his hand and grasped the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure in his hand. With a sudden pull, the great Tao emerged from the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. Like water being drawn out, it began to be constantly drawn out from the oil lamp. Surprisingly, he decided to follow Hongouzi's instructions and give up on the great Tao fragments that he had worked so hard to obtain. To the Genesis sage, the most important thing was to turn the false into the true, break through the shackles of a false sage, and become a true sage. Compared to this, no matter how many things there were, even a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, they weren't anything at all. They could all be discarded at any time. After a while, a small great Tao that looked complete appeared in front of the sages. The Genesis sage did not hesitate to send the great Tao fragment to Hongouzi. In the blink of an eye, the great Tao fragment was in Hongouzi's hand. "Since fellow Taoist wants it, I will give these great Tao fragments to you," the Genesis sage said as his figure flashed and disappeared. He had broken away from the strange state of chaos. Of course, this was just his attitude. For the sages, as long as they were in this world, it made no difference whether they were here or not. They could still easily sense his existence. Even if they wanted to talk to him, it was the same as if he was still in this strange state. Hongouzi praised, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist." With that, he sent the great Tao fragment into the smoke-like great Tao fragment behind him. In an instant, it was twisted and disintegrated by the smoke-like great Tao fragment. It completely fused with the smoke-like great Tao fragment, making the smoke-like great Tao fragment thicker. It also became thicker as the smoke-like great Tao fragment changed. Hongouzi's aura seemed to grow a little stronger. At this time, the sage Zhan Hui and the others looked at each other, shaking their heads and sighing. They raised their hands and waved, summoning their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures from the outside world and returning them to their hands. Then, without hesitation, they began to extract the great Tao fragments from the pseudo-origin spiritual treasures. Long rivers that seemed to be complete great Taos were continuously extracted from the pseudo-origin spiritual treasures. Along with the appearance of the grand Tao, an indescribable fluctuation started to appear in this bizarre state. Vaguely, there seemed to be a mysterious world appearing here, as if there were endless laws spreading out. In a trance, the place seemed to have turned into an unseen world. It was the gathering of many great Tao fragments. They naturally emitted power, and the mysteries of the great Tao naturally leaked out. It was a change in the surrounding space-time. The sages didn't say anything, and there wasn't a trace of regret on their faces. After extracting the great Tao fragments, they directly sent them over to Hongouzi, who caught them with one hand. They were sent directly into the smoke-like area behind him. During this process, even the Boulder Saint, who had also grasped a part of a true saint's divine ability, did the same. He did the same thing, but he didn't seem to be any different from the others. The foundation of the monolith saint was derived from the world, derived from the true divine mystique in Luo Fan's heart. However, due to Luo Fan's insufficient realm, his understanding of the true divine mystique was very limited. In the end, he only managed to derive a small part of the true divine mystique before stopping. He did not integrate all the mysteries of the true divine mystique into the world in his heart. Therefore, from a fundamental point of view, The mysteries of the true saint's divine ability that the bolder saint possessed were already incomplete. Back then, because it was in the world in Luo Fan's heart, he could easily use the characteristics of that world to allow Luo Fan, who possessed the true cultivation method of the divine ability, to cultivate that divine ability. However, although he had heard the many great Tao sounds that Luo Fan had told him back then, he had broken through his limits and pushed his cultivation realm back to the false saint realm. However, from the beginning until now, he had never truly obtained the cultivation method of the divine ability. In other words, it was impossible for him to completely integrate the many mysteries of the divine ability with the cultivation method. As a result, although he had mastered many of the mysteries of the true divine theurgy, he could only display a portion of the power of the true divine theurgy. Although this power was already much more powerful than the pseudo-sage mystique, it was still far from the complete true sage mystique. At this moment, the true saint's divine ability that Luo Fan unleashed could easily tangle with Hongguzi's divine ability for an eternity. However, if the bolder saint were to use the true divine ability that he had mastered, he definitely wouldn't be able to last more than a few days, even though he wouldn't be eliminated right away. It was precisely because of this that the monolith saint didn't have the confidence to fight against Hongguzi. That was why he turned his attention to the vast thousand world where Luo Fan and Hongguzi's true saint divine abilities were entangled. He wanted to see the interaction between the two true saint divine abilities. Luo Fan merely sighed inwardly at the monolith saint's performance. If the bolder saint hadn't changed so much after becoming a saint, perhaps he would have already passed on that true divine ability to him. After all, before meeting Hongguzi, his understanding of the true divine ability was limited to the fact that it was much more powerful than the false divine ability. He didn't truly understand how terrifying it was. However, there was no way he could pass on this true divine ability to the bolder saint now. What a powerful force! It was almost enough to change the entire situation in the universe. He definitely wouldn't be willing to hand it over to someone he couldn't absolutely trust. Hongguzi was rather satisfied with the saint's performance. He didn't reject any of the great Tao fragments that they sent over. He absorbed all of them into the fog behind him, completely dispersing them, devouring them, and fusing them together, causing the fog to become thicker and clearer in the process. At the same time, his own strength seemed to become more and more profound and unfathomable. After the saints extracted the great Tao fragments from their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and handed them over to Hongguzi, like the Genesis saint, they didn't stay in this strange state. Instead, they directly left this strange state and disappeared into the fulcrum of the various worlds, disappearing from Luo Fan and Hongguzi's sight. While such a drastic change was happening in the flying sword in the void outside, the two rays of light gradually came to an end against the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Those pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were damaged more and more clearly under the attacks of the true sage-level attacks that erupted from the two beams of light. Finally, after several days, the first pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure to be destroyed by this attack appeared. A soft puff sound was heard. Between the two rays of light, a magic treasure that looked like a drum trembled and shattered with a loud bang. However, compared to the bottle that Luo Fan had broken before, this pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure was much smaller than the one he had broken before. They saw, in the blink of an eye, the fragments had completely disappeared. Only a shrunken path was left in that spot, appearing in the illusory treasure light. Besides the great Tao, everything that belonged to this pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure had completely disappeared, even the terrifying impact of its destruction. The astonishing fluctuations formed were instantly reduced to nothingness. It was as if an ordinary object had been shattered, and this was like a signal. In an instant, more and more pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures began to break apart. With a light puff 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 sound, countless magic tool fragments turned into nothingness. Then, a complete miniature great Tao appeared within the light. Not long after, more than 100 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures had completely disappeared. Replacing them were more than 100 miniature Great Tao. At this moment, the battlefield had already become dead silent. The many false saints didn't even dare to say a word at that moment. Everything that happened to Ah Sheng had completely subverted their beliefs. Originally, if so many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were to combine, it would be enough to completely destroy every world in the universe. But at this moment, they were besieged, crushed, and completely shattered by the two beams of light emitted from a small major kiliocosm. How ridiculous was this? If it were in the past, they would definitely treat such a thing as a joke. Even if the person who said this said that the two beams of light came from a true sage, they would definitely not change their attitude. But at this moment, the truth that they treated as a joke appeared in front of them. Furthermore, it was a sage treasure that targeted them. How could they react in time? That piece of heaven and earth floated in the void, motionless, just like their deathly still souls. After the two beams of light minced the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, they gradually dissipated, leaving behind more than 100 miniature Great Tao that appeared in the void. They pulsed slightly and emitted fluctuations that only a true Great Tao could emit, as well as the layers of endless treasure light emitted by the battle between the two true sage divine powers. At this moment, Luo Fan and Hun Guzi attacked at the same time. The power that belonged to the primordial essence spirit treasures suddenly rushed out of the flying sword and turned into palms that grabbed at the miniature Great Tao in the void. The power of the two pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures didn't hold back at all. Their speeds accelerated to their limits. In the end, they each grabbed half of the miniature Great Tao. Along with the power of the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, they shrank back into the world that resembled half a flying sword and appeared in the hands of Luo Fan and Hun Guzi. Chapter 1497. Throughout the entire process, neither Luo Fan nor Hun Guzi spoke a word. Luo Fan didn't explain his actions, and Hun Guzi didn't question why Luo Fan wanted to compete with him for these grand Daos. Although Luo Fan had only expressed that he wanted to keep his pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, that he had the strength to protect himself, and that he would support Hun Guzi in gathering more pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to build his own high-level world, that didn't mean that he would sit back and watch Hun Guzi constantly improve. At this moment, Hun Guzi and Hun Guzi were like enemies and friends. He couldn't trust him completely. If Hun Guzi suddenly grew stronger by tens or hundreds of times, it would be extremely bad news for Luo Fan, who knew when Hun Guzi would attack Luo Fan and take his pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure as his own, turning it into resources to build that heaven and earth in the future. After all, the more pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures there were, the better it would be for the heaven and earth to be constructed. The heaven and earth that was constructed would also be stronger and more likely to meet Hun Guzi's requirements. If Hun Guzi had the opportunity to put Luo Fan's pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure into the heaven and earth, why would he be polite to him? Therefore, the best way was for Luo Fan to also strengthen himself and increase his strength. He had to collect many great Tao fragments in order to achieve what he wanted. He had to be able to truly improve himself to the point where no matter how strong Hun Guzi became, he was confident he could protect himself. Only then could he feel at ease. Luo Fan understood this point, and Hun Guzi naturally understood it as well. Therefore, Hun Guzi wasn't surprised that Luo Fan fought with him for the Grand Tao fragments. He didn't think there was anything wrong with it. If Luo Fan didn't do this, he would feel that Luo Fan was a little pedantic and ignorant. He didn't deserve to be on the same level as him. If that was the case, he might immediately make a move against him and launch a sneak attack. Luo Fan didn't gain much advantage in the division of the Grand Tao fragments. Similarly, Hun Guzi didn't obtain more Grand Tao fragments than him. Both of them. He had roughly divided up all the fragments of the Great Tao. After those fragments of the Great Path surged into the Heaven Cauldron, the cauldron's power exploded madly. Endless mystical power attacked the Great Path, shattering the miniature Great Path into endless fragments. Subsequently, then, it used the Great Path inside the heavenly cauldron to devour them again and completely fuse the countless fragments of the Great Path into itself. In the end, the Great Path fragment that had turned into a miniature Great Path inside the heavenly cauldron began to grow wildly. Originally, the Great Path fragments that Luo Fan had obtained were already close to 1/20th of the Great Path fragments in the two worlds. In other words, it was equivalent to 1/10 of the Great Path fragments in one world. Presently, even though every single one of the Grandao fragments he'd obtained couldn't compare to even half of the Grandao fragments he'd obtained, they were numerous after all, and there were an entire 60 to 70 of them. With so many fragments of the Great Path fused together, the Great Path inside the heavenly cauldron finally broke through its limit. It allowed it to truly grow to a level that surpassed the Great Tao that could normally give birth to sages, or even far surpassed it. When a number of the Great Path fragments completely stabilized and turned into a complete Great Path again, Luo Fan instantly felt that the heavenly cauldron's power had already made a qualitative leap. In the blink of an eye, the eternal, indestructible, all-knowing, and omnipotent aura that it emitted skyrocketed several times. Faintly. In fact, it was already above the world it resided in. At this moment, the Great Path of this world seemed to be unable to withstand the pressure of this primordial origin spiritual treasure. Crackling sounds constantly came from the Great Path of this world. Moreover, there were countless densely packed tiny cracks that enveloped the endless space-time of this world. This time, no matter how much Luo Fan suppressed the power of the heavenly cauldron, he couldn't stop this situation from continuing. No matter what, those cracks, no matter what, continued to spread and continued to grow. The entire world was already heading towards destruction, towards the final doomsday. When Luo Fan sensed this, he knew that it was because the Great Path of the heavenly cauldron had surpassed the Great Path of this world by too much. After all, after fusing with the numerous Great Path fragments, the Great Path of the heavenly cauldron was already 3 times stronger than the Great Path of this world. Such a situation was like forcefully stuffing something the size of a room into a fridge. Obviously, the only possibility was that it would burst the fridge. He sighed when he saw this, took a step forward, and stepped into the heavenly cauldron. Then, the heavenly cauldron shook and left this world. It transformed into a flying sword and floated in the mysterious void. It appeared outside the world that had numerous sages. After all, he had stayed in that world for such a long time. Although he did not have many feelings for it, he was still somewhat familiar with it. He was not willing to watch this world be destroyed for an unnecessary reason. Since the world could no longer accommodate his existence, there was naturally no need for him to stay in that world and allow it to be destroyed because of this. When the heavenly cauldron left that world, he felt that the supreme authority he obtained from that world had completely vanished. What replaced it was the supreme authority that the Great Path within the heavenly cauldron gave him. The heavenly cauldron was refined by him, and the Great Path fragments within it were gathered and refined by him bit by bit. Obviously, he was equivalent to the creator of the Great Path. Even though he was unable to completely grasp all the power and profundities of this Grand Tao, because he had used a trick, at the very least, it was an extremely simple and ordinary thing for him to obtain the supreme authority he desired from it. It was also thanks to the fact that this Grand Tao was complete that he was able to treat this Grand Tao like he treated the world. Otherwise, if the Great Path wasn't complete, the supreme authority would naturally be greatly reduced. It wouldn't be enough for him to possess the power of a false saint. Moreover, because the Great Path itself was more powerful than the Great Path of the world, the power he possessed was not something that the world could compare to even if he obtained the supreme authority. He could still use the more than 3 billion false saint abilities, and its power was even more astonishing than in the world. As for the true saint ability, it wasn't a problem at all. After the heavenly cauldron left that world, the destruction of the world slowed down a little. However, it didn't completely disappear. Apart from the heavenly cauldron, which was a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that surpassed the limits of the world, there was another person. He also surpassed the limits of the world. The heavenly cauldron had fused with so many great path fragments that it surpassed the limits of the world. The great path behind Hunguzi would have fused with even more great path fragments, so it naturally surpassed the limits of the world. Now, Luofan had left that world, but Hunguzi was still there. How could the destruction of the world be slowed down? What a pity. It seems that from now on, I have no fate with the ordinary world. Hunguzi sighed and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he was already not far from Luofan's heavenly cauldron. Although he wasn't as familiar with that world as Luofan was, he still had to give Luofan some face. Since Luofan didn't want that world to be destroyed, he naturally couldn't deliberately sing a different tune in front of Luofan. He wasn't ready to completely fall out with Luofan from the outside. That world looked like a flying sword with countless cracks inside and outside, as if it was pieced together by countless fragments. But at this moment, the countless cracks on its surface were rapidly mending. They quickly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, the flying sword looked completely normal. There was nothing special about it anymore. It was the Genesis Saint and the others who repaired the Great Path. They repaired the world, returning it to normal. What a pity. Wealth moves people's hearts. I wonder how much longer this world can exist. Hunguzi turned to look at the world and couldn't help but smile. He seemed to be talking to himself. It's their choice, they deserve to pay the price for their choice. Luofan's voice came from the heavenly cauldron. Then, before his voice could fade away, the heavenly cauldron's shape slowly changed. The shape of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court slowly changed. In the blink of an eye, the three-legged cauldron turned into a human figure, a figure that was exactly the same as Luofan. Naturally, this change wasn't because Luofan had completely fused with the heavenly cauldron and turned it into his body in a short period of time. All it did was change the shape of the divine court heaven cauldron, allowing it to take on the appearance of its body. As a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, no matter what its original function was, how powerful it was, or how miraculous it wasn't a problem for them. The heavenly cauldron was no exception. This change was just a change in form. It didn't change its original function at all, but it was quite useful for communication. Although the change in form wasn't enough to change a sage's attitude completely, the feeling of seeing a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure swaying in front of them and seeing a false sage swaying in front of them were obviously different. The former would only tempt them and make them involuntarily want to take the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure for themselves and completely refine the great path fragments within it. As for the latter, it would only put them on guard. This was the reason why Luofan had changed the appearance of the heavenly cauldron. Of course, it was a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure after all. Even if it was just a change in form, it could still be used by Luofan as a body. No matter what it felt like, whether it was touch, hearing, sight, smell, or even taste, it was the same. Hunguzi wasn't surprised to see the change in the heavenly cauldron. He just smiled and said, "That's their choice. What about fellow Taoist?" "My choice. I just want to see if what the sage said is true." Luofan also smiled. Although the surface of the flying sword had returned to normal, it seemed to be intact. However, at this moment, it was constantly emitting layers of treasure light that belonged to a true divine. It continued to spread out in all directions, enveloping countless lands and worlds in the surroundings. Clearly, it was emitted from the vast thousand worlds where Luofan's true saint divine ability and Hunguzi's true saint divine ability were engaged in an eternal battle. This treasure light had the characteristics of a true sage, but was not something that any false sage level power could conceal. No matter how hard Genesis Sage and the others tried to hide, it was impossible. As long as they existed in this world, they would continue to spread. It was as if he was loudly proclaiming his existence to all the saints in the universe at all times. He was telling the many sages that he had the power of a true sage and was tempting them to come here and snatch it. This could be seen from how the Genesis sage had decisively abandoned his primordial origin spiritual treasure in exchange for this vast thousand worlds. How tempting was the power of a true sage to a false sage? It could be said that as long as it existed, those false sages would naturally set their sights on it. In the end, until they truly obtained that power, and this clearly meant that the world would become the target of everyone, and it would have to endure countless attacks. In the end, destruction was almost certain. The only thing left in suspense was how long this world could last and how long it would take for it to be destroyed. However, this was all. For the Genesis sage and the others, they should have already been mentally prepared. At this moment, after Luo Fan and the others left that world, the flying sword began to head into the depths of the void. The direction of the void was the direction with the least number of sages. This void was like the starry sky of the universe, and the countless worlds in it were like the countless stars in the starry sky of the universe. There was no concept of distance in the entire void. In other words, as long as one had a thought, as long as one could understand the structure of the void, one could instantly cross any distance in the concept of the void and go to almost any place in the void. However, this did not mean that there was no division in the void, nor did it mean that all the worlds were mixed together. If that was the case, why would there be a need to divide the battlefields? All the worlds that participated in the war had long been mixed in one battlefield. This division of nothingness was not based on distance, but on a very strange spatial dimension that seemed to be higher than nothingness. This kind of space dimension was like the time dimension that controlled the flow of time in the universe from a supreme level. It was an extremely mysterious place that even a pseudo-sage could not explain clearly. That kind of supreme dimension of time could allow the universe to maintain the same speed of time as long as it was not distorted by any saints. In contrast, the spatial dimension was even more mysterious. It seemed to be able to define the spatial perception of all living beings, even the spatial perception of the void, as well as the spatial perception of everything that originally had no time or space. As a result, a state that should not have been limited by distance or space had such a perception of distance and space. It was just like the void that had no time or space at this moment. This was also the fundamental reason why it was impossible for many sages in the void to cross the void and come to any active world with a thought. This was because when the world moved, their own spatial attributes had not completely stabilized. They completely followed the rules of the supreme spatial dimension. If one wanted to rush there, they could only follow the rules of this spatial dimension. Once the world stopped moving and its spatial attributes stabilized, the supreme time dimension would naturally disappear and no longer occupy the absolute dominion. Naturally, one could cross the void and come to the world with a thought. This was actually the same as the time dimension. Under normal circumstances, sages would not distort the time of the world, and the world would naturally flow according to the time dimension. However, as long as sages wanted to, they could distort it at any time and speed up or slow down the flow of time to an unbelievable level. In contrast, the spatial dimension was only slightly different from this. It was precisely because nothingness had such a supreme spatial dimension at work that there was such a method of choosing a direction to fly in to avoid detection and attacks. This was the direction chosen by the world that had turned into a flying sword. Obviously, it was the direction where the density of the world was lower under the rules of the supreme spatial dimension. In order to avoid the prying of other sages as much as possible, this was the only way. They could only fly in the direction where the density of the world was lower. Only then would the layers of treasure light that spread out in the world not be so conspicuous, and only then would it be able to escape the control of other sages. Only then would it be possible for the Genesis sage and the others to have more time to comprehend the remarkable abilities of the two true sages in the major Kiliacosm. Because Luo Fan had already left that world, the fulcrum of that world was not controlled by a false sage existence. Therefore, although the flying sword speed was not much slower than before, it did not feel as agile as before, and its changes were a little stiff, as he was thinking about flying in the depths of the void. However, he often accidentally flew past some major kiliocosms and destroyed many of them. This caused more and more major kiliocosms to turn into fragments, leaving behind the flying sword. In the end, a faint trace was left in the void. A very smart choice, Hun Guzi said with a smile. It was unknown whether he was talking about the choice of the Genesis sage and the others or Luo Fan's choice. Luo Fan could not be bothered to investigate further. He said, "Fellow Taoist, you seem to have mentioned before that there are many false sages under the sages. I wonder if they have the same thoughts? Perhaps. I haven't contacted them," Hun Guzi said with a smile. When Luo Fan heard this, he could not help but shake his head and sigh. It seemed that things might not go as smoothly as he had imagined. Every false sage was in existence with an extremely firm will. In other words, once they made a decision, they would almost always go to the end. This could be seen from the performance of the many false sages. They even directly started such a tragic war to show their attitude. Originally, he thought that since the disciples of the sages had received guidance from the sages, they should have already unified their opinions and decided what to do. However, he did not think that. They actually did not contact each other. There was no connection. Although it seemed like a small detail, such a detail was enough to reflect many things. If they did not have any differences, why would they not contact each other? Could it be that these disciples of the sages did not know that cooperating with each other would make things go more smoothly and save them 10 times the effort? Therefore, they did not contact each other. There was only one possibility. That was, they knew that it was useless even if they contacted each other. It was impossible to make things go more smoothly and save them energy. Obviously, this was only because they understood that there was a major difference between them. It seems that there is still quite a bit of trouble. Luo Fan sighed. Hun Guzi smiled and said, "Don't worry. Although there are some small differences, we will definitely win in the end." Win? I think the myriad worlds are probably in danger. Luo Fan smiled bitterly. What Luo Fan was referring to was the true saint's theurgy. Since Hun Guzi had the true saint's theurgy, the disciples of the other sages should also have it. If there was a war between the disciples of the sages, the true saint's theurgy would naturally be used. At that time, the divine abilities of true sages would fight with each other, and in the end, they would be entangled for an eternity. If one wasn't careful, it was possible that all the worlds in the universe would be destroyed, just like the many pseudo-primordial spirit treasures that had been destroyed in this void. Hun Guzi obviously understood what Luo Fan meant, but he did not look worried at all. He smiled and said, "It might have been dangerous before, but now it definitely won't be." Obviously, he believed that the disciples of the sages now knew the characteristics of the true saint's theurgy, so they would defend themselves carefully and do everything possible to avoid the worst situation. This kind of thinking seemed to be wishful thinking, but it was the confidence of the disciples of the sages. It was also the trust between the disciples of the sages. Although Luo Fan knew why Hun Guzi was so confident, he did not have much confidence in him. He only said, "I hope so." Just as Luo Fan and Hun Guzi were talking, a voice entered their ears. "May I know what the two Taoists need our help with?" Chapter 1498. A little slower than him, the figures of saints also appeared beside him and on the surface of the world around him. www. 23us. But their appearances clearly showed their attitude. Luo Fan smiled and didn't speak. He just looked at Hun Guzi. He had already gained a great advantage, so there was no need for him to stand out at this time. Instead, he gave the opportunity to Hun Guzi. Hun Guzi naturally knew what Luo Fan meant, but he didn't care. He said indifferently, "For the time being, there's nothing for you to do. You can do as you wish." Hearing this, the false sage nodded faintly and said, "Farewell." Then, the heavens and earths turned and headed towards the depths of the void. The direction it chose was the direction of the beginning sage's world. The sages of the other heavens and earths also slightly bowed to Hun Guzi at this moment. Then, They each controlled their own heavens and earth and chased after the world that had turned into a flying sword. They were false sages and could clearly feel the power of the two true sage divine abilities. They naturally had a strong desire for the vast thousand world that contained the divine abilities of the two true sage divine abilities. How could they sit back and watch that world disappear before their eyes? Since Hunguzi had told them to do as they wished, they naturally didn't stand on ceremony and chased after the flying sword to snatch that vast thousand world. At the same time, many heavens and earths with sages in the void began to move and began to gather in the direction of the flying sword. It should be known, only a portion of the heavens and earths had participated in the previous battle. A large portion of the heavens and earths didn't participate and were just waiting for the outcome of the battle. They didn't have any desire to participate in the previous battle, but their desire for the true sage divine abilities wasn't any weaker than that of any sage. Seeing that the vast thousand world that contained the true sage divine abilities was about to disappear from their sensing range, how could they be willing to do so? In a short while, there were hundreds of heavens and earths surrounding the flying sword that was condensed from the heavens and earths. Moreover, these hundreds of heavens and earths were all different. They weren't like the heavens and earths that had left in front of Luo Fan and Hunguzi. They weren't heavens and earths that had lost many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Instead, each of the heavens and earths had a large number of pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth and display their power perfectly outside the heavens and earth. Their level of danger. They were completely incomparable to these heavens and earths. Luo Fan and Hunguzi watched the movements of the world. However, no one dared to stop him. None of them stopped them. The fact that these worlds hadn't participated in the war before was already enough to show their attitude. As long as he could gather all of the pseudo-primordial essence, spirit treasures together in the end, he would be able to do so. The sages in the world would naturally take the initiative to fuse their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures with them, and there was no need for them to attack them. Since that was the case, he naturally didn't need to attack them. As for Luo Fan, although he was rather familiar with the flying sword and was unwilling to see it destroyed, he also knew that the Genesis Saint and the others would definitely be able to handle the situation well and make the right choice at the appropriate time to protect that part of the world. After all, they were all false saints and could naturally recognize the situation. They would naturally give up when there was truly no way to resist or when there was truly nothing they could do. In any case, changing the flow of time in the world was just a matter of a thought for the sages. Perhaps before the situation developed to such a terrible state, they would have been able to study the two true divine, remarkable powers for billions of years or even trillions of years. This would be enough for them to give up on the vast thousand worlds or gain many benefits. Even if they were to give up on the vast thousand worlds in the end, the two true divine, remarkable powers would not be unacceptable to them. Since that was the case, Luo Fan naturally didn't need to stop those worlds. Which world is our next target? Luo Fan turned his attention back to Hunguzi after glancing at the other worlds and asked directly. Hunguzi raised his hand and pointed. It's that world. Luo Fan looked up and saw that it was a world that looked like a seal. At this time, the world was participating in a tragic war involving more than 20 worlds and a total of more than 200 saints. Because that place was in the space dimension of Earth's universe, it was too far away from where Luo Fan and the others were. Therefore, the treasure light produced by the true divine, remarkable powers of Luo Fan and Hunguzi did not spread to them. Therefore, at this moment, the sages who were fighting did not make the same choice as the sages on this battlefield because of the treasure light. In other words, they were still fighting. At this moment, almost all the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that were fighting on the battlefield were more or less damaged. Of course, because all the sages who were participating in the battle had an unimaginable view of the overall situation, even though every pseudo-spiritual treasure was damaged, the one that was truly destroyed had not appeared. However, it had also reached a critical point. However, it had also reached a critical point. Soon, on Luo Fan's battlefield, the destruction of the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure would occur on that battlefield. Could it be that a disciple of a saint is also hidden there? Luo Fan looked around and discovered that this world was also opposed to condensing the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures into a complete world. In other words, the saints of this world were also opposed to handing over their pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. In other words, in this war, they were actually on the same side as Luo Fan. Exactly. Hun Guzi smiled. Which sage is he a disciple of? Luo Fan asked curiously. Even though Hun Guzi was hidden in the Great Tao Fragment, however, Luo Fan did not believe that all the disciples of the sages would make such a choice. Most of the disciples of the sages were definitely pretending to be ordinary false sages. You'll know when the time comes. Hun Guzi smiled. As he spoke, he took a step forward and his figure moved in the void. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the void. The moment Hun Guzi appeared, the entire battlefield fell silent. One had to know that at this moment, Hun Guzi had appeared here with his main body, while he was a false sage. He could actually leave this world. He appeared in the void with his main body, and there were no signs of his realm dropping. He was still a complete false sage, and could still unleash the terrifying power of a false sage. This situation, compared to the time when Luo Fan and the others integrated the Great Tao Fragments into the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. It was even more subversive to allow the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to have the power to transcend the shackles of heaven and earth. If a false sage could leave this world and not drop his realm, would he still be a false sage? This completely subversive situation was compared to their original goal. Obviously, they care more about it. That was why the moment Hun Guzi appeared, they naturally stopped fighting. However, there was a world that was different from the others. That world was the world that looked like a seal. Compared to the other sages who were shocked by Hun Guzi's ability to break free from the shackles of heaven and earth, the sages in that world were clearly shocked by Hun Guzi's appearance, or rather, his identity. Hun Guzi, why are you here? A pseudo-primordial essence, spirit treasure, spun slightly and condensed a figure in the void. It said coldly to Hun Guzi. This figure was the figure of a woman. The woman had a curvaceous figure and a beautiful face. She wore a light yellow robe and exuded an elegant and noble temperament. However, at this moment, the woman's expression was very cold. It was obvious that she was in a bad mood. Hun Guzi laughed and said, "My original plan of waiting for success has failed. Now, of course, I can only do it myself. Isn't this obvious? Fellow Taoist Feng, do it yourself? Do you want to fight me personally?" The woman whom Hun Guzi referred to as Shitsi Feng said with an ugly expression, "If you insist on standing in front of me, then we'll have no choice but to fight. What's your choice?" Hun Guzi laughed. Shitsi Feng's expression was quite ugly. She turned her eyes and saw Luo Fan at the side. Her expression changed, and she said, "Fellow Taoist, I've never seen you before. May I know how to address you?" Luo Fan. Luo Fan said concisely, "Fellow Taoist Luo Fan, since you're with Hun Guzi, do you know who we are?" Shitsi Feng asked. "Of course I do. You and I actually came from the same place," Luo Fan said with a smile. "I see. Then, do you know what will happen after he fuses all the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures together?" Shitsi Feng asked again. At this moment, the over 200 sages on the battlefield were already dumbfounded as they watched everything that was happening before them. Previously, it was already subversive enough for Hun Guzi to be able to maintain the power of a false sage after leaving the world with his true body. At this time, there was actually another false sage who was clearly the same as them and had nothing special about him. However, at this time, there was actually another false sage who was clearly the same as them and had displayed all kinds of changes that were completely beyond their understanding. Even though they were false sages, it was not easy for them to react. However, even if they did not react, these pseudo-saints had already begun to be vigilant. Other than the pseudo-saint in the seal, the other pseudo-saints had all retracted their pseudo-primordial primordial origin spiritual treasures around them and were on guard. Whether it was Luo Fan, Hunguzi, or Shitsi Feng, none of them cared about any of this. Although these false sages were powerful, they were not much of a threat to them. As long as they exerted their strength, their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures would naturally be easily destroyed by them. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not need to pay too much attention to them. At this moment, the three of them were paying more attention to each other. When Luo Fan heard Shitsi Feng's words, he naturally shook his head and said, "I'm not too sure about the specifics. I wonder if you can teach me?" Shitsi Feng smirked coldly. He glanced at Hunguzi and said, "It seems like he didn't tell you everything." However, Hunguzi only smiled and completely ignored Shitsi Feng's blatant provocation, as if he did not hear it at all. He quietly waited for Shitsi Feng to say what she wanted to say. By fusing all the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures together, it is indeed possible to create a world that is stronger than almost any other world. It might even reach the level of our world. However, this world is extremely unstable. It requires thousands of false sages to be sacrificed. Only then can it truly take shape. Moreover, after it takes shape, it might even cause a huge impact on our world. In the end, it might even destroy our world. Shitsi Feng said coldly. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. This was something that he had not thought of before. However, think about it. Shitsi Feng's words were not without reason. After all, if thousands of pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures were fused together, it would be equivalent to the fusion of hundreds of great Daos that could give birth to a world. It would form a world that was countless times stronger than an ordinary world that could give birth to a sage. Of course, it was impossible for such a world to reach the level of a perfect world like the Earth's universe. However, it was already strong enough to reach an unimaginable level. It was possible for it to affect the stability of the entire Earth and the universe. Seeing the expression on Luo Fan's face, Shitsi Feng nodded in satisfaction and said, "Therefore, it is impossible for this world to take shape. The many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures can never be fused together." "Are you done? Isn't it my turn to speak?" Hunguzi said at this moment. What else do you have to say?" Shitsi Feng said coldly. "Since you got the information from Sage Niuhua, I can naturally get it from my master. Why don't I have anything to say?" Hunguzi said with a smile. Hearing this, Luo Fan finally learned Shitsi Feng's background. "So it's Niuhua. I should have known. Rain Deity Child, Shitsi Feng, these names sound somewhat related." Rain Deity Child was a pseudo-saint that Luo Fan had met when he first stepped into the unbroken earth. He was also the disciple of the only Saint Supreme he had ever met, Niuhua. Shitsi Feng snorted coldly at Hunguzi's words, but didn't say anything else. Seeing this, Hunguzi smiled with satisfaction and said, "Although this world might become extremely powerful after it's formed, it's still impossible for it to threaten our world. Have you forgotten about our master's existence? Moreover, if we can control this world after it takes shape, we'll have a chance to break through our current realm and become a true saint. Compared to that insignificant risk, isn't the benefit worth the risk? As for the blood sacrifice of 1,000 pseudo-saints, what's the big deal? Pseudo-saints are fake to begin with, and they can't live forever. They'll die in the future. So what does it matter if they die a little earlier or a little later?" Shitsi Feng's expression changed drastically when he heard this. "Hunguzi, don't you try to mislead us with your lies. We pseudo-saints have worked hard for billions of years to become saints, but you're going to sacrifice them for your own selfish gain? How cruel is that? How can you say such words in such a dignified manner?" It wasn't just Hunguzi. Even Luo Fan was looking at Shitsi Feng with a strange look in his eyes. Pseudo-saints had taken billions of years to become saints, and that was something he agreed with. However, he clearly didn't agree with the cruelty of sacrificing them for blood sacrifice. Anyone with a normal mind should be well aware of the cruelty of the cultivation world. Putting everything else aside, just the living beings in the vast thousand worlds and the countless cultivators in the worlds with sages had always been destroyed in the battles between false sages. Could it be that those cultivators' cultivation time was too short? Could it be that their deaths were really insignificant, and they didn't need to be pitted? Moreover, Shi Feng had grown to this point, and had even obtained enough great Tao fragments to upgrade her primordial origin spiritual treasure to the point where it could surpass the shackles of heaven and earth and unleash its power freely outside of heaven and earth. Could it be that she had also participated in the destruction of a world with a saint? Could it be that she didn't annihilate the countless cultivators in that world in the process? Not to mention how the countless vast world around the battlefield had disappeared. How could she do such a thing from such a standpoint? How could Shi Feng say such naive words? Could this person really be a pseudo-saint? Could he really be a disciple of a saint? For a moment, Luo Fan couldn't help but have some doubts. You're still so naive. At this moment, a voice suddenly entered their ears. Following this voice, a figure stepped out of the void. This figure was also a pseudo-saint, and it was also his real body. However, he didn't directly use the great Tao to appear behind him to maintain the power of his pseudo-saint. Instead, he directly integrated the great Tao into his body. At this moment, his body was more like a great Tao, but it wasn't a body of flesh and blood. This figure looked like a young man. This young man was wearing a long robe. He stood there. He was like a sharp sword. His entire body emitted a dazzling light. There was also a kind of eternal, indestructible, and omnipotent aura constantly emitted from his body. It constantly filled the surroundings and collided with the surroundings, causing the pseudo-saints who were already dumbfounded to be even more vigilant. I didn't expect you to come out too. It seems like you've also sensed the changes on my side, Hun Guzi said with a smile when he saw the man. Of course. How could I not have sensed such a huge commotion on your side? Only someone like Shi Feng, who doesn't pay attention to the outside world, would be able to participate in this kind of war without noticing it all. The man laughed. My name is Jian Kuangzi, and I'm a disciple of the Supreme Saint, Tong Tian. I heard from Junior Brother Battle Godson that he has a good relationship with a cultivator called Luo Fan. I guess that's you? The man laughed. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and then he laughed. So you're Taoist Battle God's son's senior brother. It seems like it's really fate. I wonder how Taoist Battle Godson is doing now. I haven't contacted him for a long time. I don't know what he was sent to do by Master. Even I only occasionally contacted him a few million years ago. I don't know how he's doing now, Jin Kuangzi said with a sigh. I see. I thought he had also become a pseudo-saint, Luo Fan said with a smile. How is that possible? He is not willing to walk the same path as us. Right now, he only wants to obtain more pointers from Master so that he can directly become a true sage. He'll have to wait until he really hits a wall before he can settle for the next best thing, Jin Kuangzi said with a sigh. Perhaps he'll be able to walk it. After all, the timing is a little special now, Luo Fan said with a smile. Perhaps, Jin Kuangzi said with a smile. All right, are you guys done chatting? Is now the time to reminisce? Hun Guzi said helplessly. Sorry, where were we? Jin Kuangzi said without sincerity. Hearing this, Hun Guzi felt helpless. He pointed at Teacher Feng and said, She's still so naive. How am I naive? Teacher Feng couldn't help but ask coldly. Isn't she naive enough? She actually rejected the opportunity to progress just because she's sad about the death of these pseudo-saints. Isn't that naive? Jin Kuangzi said indifferently. Teacher Feng's expression became extremely ugly. If she can really become a true saint, I naturally won't stop her. However, it's impossible for her to succeed. If becoming a true saint was that easy, why didn't Master and Martial Uncles do it long ago? Since they haven't done it now, it means that they don't think it's possible. Who says they won't do it? Aren't they borrowing our hands to do it now? Hun Guzi said with a smile. These words caused Teacher Feng's expression to change drastically. Clearly, these words had hit her Achilles heel. She couldn't refute for a moment. It was meaningless to guess the thoughts of a saint. Chapter 1499. Shi Feng had obviously fallen for Hun Guzi's trick but he could not think of any words to refute Han Guzi's answer. He could only remain silent helplessly. It seems like we still have to fight. Jin Guangzi laughed at this moment. Obviously, Jin Guangzi's standpoint was the same as Han Guzi's. He also wanted to gather all the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures and condense them into a world. Of course, his words were directed at Shi Feng. Come on then. Let me see how much the two of you have improved after so many years. Shi Feng said coldly. As she spoke, her pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure suddenly shook slightly, and its aura suddenly skyrocketed. The speed of the skyrocketing was unimaginably fast. In the blink of an eye, it had already skyrocketed to more than 100 times its original size. Immediately after, a figure stepped out of the world that looked like a seal and directly merged with the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Following that, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had completely transformed into a woman. It was not just a transformation of the form, but a transformation from the root. It was as if the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had truly become the woman's body. The entire process transcended time and space. Even if she stepped out from that world and fused with the magic treasure, there was still a process. Even if Han Guzi and the others could clearly see the entire process, they couldn't stop her. They couldn't stop her before she fused with the magic treasure. This, obviously, it was an extremely mysterious method that might even be close to the true divine ability. Of course, it was only close. Of course, it could not be the true divine ability. It was just to come out of the world and enter the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, but it was not enough for Shi Feng to use the true divine ability. Such a change was natural to Han Guzi and the others, but to the other false saints, it was another subversion of their views. Since when could false saints leave the world that they were born in so easily? When? The false saints were no longer controlled by the world. I didn't expect you to be the one who schemed the most. Jin Guangzi sighed at this moment. It's not really a scheme. I'm just making some preparations in advance. Shi Feng said calmly as he stretched his body. It was impossible for an ordinary pseudo-primordial chaos numinous treasure to completely fuse with a pseudo-sage. The power of the pseudo-sage's mystical abilities would not be affected at all, and his cultivation realm would not be reduced. Even if, when they fused with it, they could also borrow the power of the pseudo-primordial origin numinous treasure to obtain power similar to that of a false sage. However, in essence, he was no longer a false saint. He did not have the eternal and indestructible characteristic of a false saint. Only a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure that was created from the great Tao fragments of the world could have such a characteristic. In other words, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that Shi Feng had refined had not only been fused with the great Tao fragments of other worlds, it had also been fused with the great Tao fragments of the world, where she had become a saint. Only then would she be able to do what she was doing. He was actually able to fuse with this magic treasure and turn it into his own new body. He shattered the great Tao of heaven and earth that he existed in and integrated the great Tao fragments into his own magic treasure. It was like an ordinary person dancing on the edge of a blade. It was like a doctor performing a heart transplant on himself. If he was not careful, the entire world would shatter, and all the living beings in it, including the false sages and himself, would be instantly destroyed. Such a thing. Even the craziest saint would not do such a thing. However, Shi Feng had really done it. This was why Jin Guangzi could not help but feel emotional. One had to know that it was almost impossible for an ordinary false sage to maintain the power of a false sage after leaving the world. However, it was not difficult for the disciples of sages. As long as they were willing to pay the price, there were many methods to choose from. However, among so many methods, Shi Feng had chosen the most dangerous method. This was the reason why Jin Guangzi sighed. Come on, as long as I'm here, you can forget about destroying any pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Shi Feng did not want to continue the topic and said, Hearing this, Hun Guzi sighed. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and waved a spiritual light toward Shitsi Feng. This spiritual light was none other than the true sage mystique that he had mastered. This mystique was still the same as before, emitting an incredible true sage aura. As soon as it appeared, it had already shocked the hearts of the many false sages on the battlefield, and indescribable greed rose in their hearts. Seeing this true sage mystique, Shitsi Feng did not hesitate either. She also raised her hand and pointed, releasing a true sage mystique. However, the true sage mystique that she released condensed into the shape of a mirror. The eternal and indestructible aura emitted from it was so strong that it was beyond everyone's imagination. As soon as it appeared, its aura intertwined with the aura of the true sage mystique that Hun Guzi released, and it began to produce all kinds of incredible changes. The many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures and false sages in the surroundings were enveloped by this aura. For a moment, their minds were in a mess, and they could not control themselves. Occasionally, a true sage power would appear. They would only be greedy. They would only want to take it for themselves. However, when the true sage mystique became like cabbages that everyone could release, their greed could no longer appear. The only emotion that would appear would be doubt whether or not he was dreaming. He might even doubt whether or not he had lived countless years like a dog. In particular, for these false sages who were the supreme existences of a part of the world, the reaction was obviously even more obvious. The true sage mystiques that the two of them released seemed to surpass time and collided. In an instant, layers of treasure light began to spread out wildly. It caused the scene from the previous battlefield to instantly appear on this battlefield. It caused all the sounds in the entire world to stop at this moment. What a grand scene! Jian Kuangzi sighed at this moment. After such a sigh, they suddenly raised their hands and waved. In an instant, a major kiliacosm instantly enveloped the two true sage mystiques that had already been entangled together, and every instant, it would change hundreds of millions of times. In an instant, the two true sage mystiques changed, and the major kiliacosm was torn apart in an instant. However, it was unable to envelop them at all. If it was originally a battle that took place in the major kiliacosm, the two true sage mystiques would naturally not cause any harm to the major kiliacosm. As for the Great Thousand World, it naturally wouldn't cause any harm to it. In fact, it could even protect it. It would not allow the major kiliacosm to be damaged. However, when the two true sage mystiques did not take place in the major kiliacosm, the situation was naturally different. If the major kiliacosm was added later, the major kiliacosm would be equivalent to an external force. It was the great Tao of the major kiliacosm. The rules and laws of the major kiliacosm, as well as the space-time within the major kiliacosm, were equivalent to external forces. This external force was an attack to the two true sage mystiques. Therefore, it would naturally be destroyed by them. Luo Fan and the others only thought of this fact after the major kiliacosm was completely torn apart. In an instant, they could not help but have a deeper understanding of the characteristics of the true sage mystiques. During the battle between the two true sage mystiques, strange worlds were created and destroyed one after another. Countless living beings were born and died. Countless contradictory attacks and contradictory states existed at almost the same time. It could be said that it had almost exhausted all the imaginations of all living beings. All kinds of mysteries that were beyond the comprehension of false saints continuously burst forth during the process. At this moment, even Teacher Foam, he had already stopped moving and was carefully observing and comprehending the changes in the process of the two true sage mystiques clashing, let alone the other false saints. At this moment, many false saints watched the process of the two true sage mystiques clashing greedily. Even though they knew that it would be extremely dangerous to stay here, they were unwilling to leave at all. In fact, the world had unknowingly gathered towards the place where the two true sage mystiques clashed. The scale of the battle between the two true sage mystiques became larger and larger, and it became more and more terrifying. At first, it was just the pure power of the two mystiques clashing. However, as time passed, the two powers derived more and more complicated changes. The scale also increased crazily. In just a few breaths' time, the scale of the two true divine omniscient powers was already more tragic, grander, and more shocking than the battle between the hundreds of false sages that was going on in this battlefield. When Luo Fan saw all of this, he directly controlled the body formed by the divine court heaven cauldron to retreating out of the range of the mystiques. At the same time, Teacher Feng, Hengouzi, and Jian Kuangzi did the same. Only those worlds with false saints could not recognize the power of the two true sage mystiques. Although they were vigilant when they saw Luo Fan and the others retreat, they were still a step too late. Almost half of the worlds were swept into the battlefield of the two mystiques. In an instant, the worlds that were originally unscathed in the tragic war were filled with cracks. As for the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures themselves, they frantically unleashed their most powerful power during the process, frantically resisting the power of the two mystiques. However, the effect was obviously quite ordinary. Although they barely managed to block the attacks of the two mystiques, it was extremely difficult. Under the attacks of the two mystiques, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were constantly damaged. The fragments on the magic treasures kept flying everywhere, and the scene was extremely tragic. At this time, how could the false saints not know how dangerous these two mystiques were? After feeling that their magic treasures were damaged and that the world was damaged, they were unwilling to fight back. They quickly retreated and tried their best to leave the battlefield of the two true sage mystiques as quickly as possible. In the end, most of the worlds escaped safely. However, the three worlds were still unable to dodge in time. Under the attacks of the two true sage mystiques that targeted the magic treasures, they shattered with a loud bang. Even the great Tao of the three worlds was directly crushed in the process, turning into countless fragments when the three worlds were destroyed. When even the great Tao was completely shattered, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in the world also lost control at the same time and completely shattered. Although, after these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures integrated with the great Tao fragments, they could already break free from the shackles of the world and exert their powerful power. However, they were the life treasures of those false saints after all. Those false saints had already completely disappeared when the world was destroyed, so these life treasures naturally shattered at the same time. However, although the magic treasures shattered, the great Tao fragments did not disappear. Although they continued to shatter continuously, they continued to shatter in the direction of the dust. However, after all, they were great Tao fragments. It was not that easy for the two true sage mystiques to completely destroy them. At this time, two people made a move. Shitzi Feng and Hengouzi. They made a move at the same time and quickly collected a large number of fragments from the two true sage mystiques. In fact, only the two of them could collect the many great Tao fragments in the battlefield of the true sage mystiques. The others, whether it was Luo Fan or Jian Kuangzi, could not do this. That was because the two true sage mystiques were released by the two of them. Therefore, only they could send their power into the battlefield and collect the many great Tao fragments without attracting the attacks of the two true sage mystiques. Anyone else, once a trace of power was injected into it, it would trigger an intense reaction from the two true sage mystiques, and the power would pour towards the owner of the power. When the time came, not to mention collecting enough great Tao fragments, it would be difficult for them to protect themselves. The two of them were equally fast, and in the blink of an eye, they had almost divided the great Tao fragments equally. Didn't you say that you were very imposing earlier? Hengouzi said as he integrated the great Tao fragments into the smoke behind him. They lost their lives because they were careless, and it has nothing to do with me. Why can't I collect these great Tao fragments? Should I just watch you take them for yourself? Shitzi Feng said coldly. Good logic, Hengouzi exclaimed. Shi Feng's expression changed slightly when she heard that. However, she did not say anything. She just continued to integrate the great Tao fragments she collected into her body, which was to say, into her pseudo-chaotic origin spiritual treasure. As the numerous great Tao fragments integrated into her body, the eternal and indestructible aura on her body became stronger and stronger. It was obvious that the power she could display had greatly increased. There were 3 worlds that were involved in the 2 true sage mystiques. Among them, the great Tao fragments collected by many false sages had at least 1 great Tao in each world. In other words, in every world, the total amount of great Tao fragments contained in the pseudo-saint primordial chaos spirit treasure was at least the complete great Tao of a world. Under such circumstances, the 2 of them almost equally divided the great Tao fragments in the true sage mystique's battlefield. In total, each of them had 3 complete great Tao fragments. With so many great Tao fragments integrated into Hung Guzi's body, compared to his original base number, it was not enough to make a qualitative change in him. However, for Shi Feng, who did not have a complete great Tao, it was a qualitative change. Almost in the blink of an eye, Shi Feng had already broken away from a state where his power was inferior to that of the world. Instead, his power had become far stronger than that of the world. This could almost be said to be the difference between positive and negative. Do you still want to fight? Hung Uzi asked with a smile. Shi Feng's expression was rather ugly, but he did not say anything. How were they supposed to fight in this situation? She was also a disciple of a sage, and she was also a false sage. How could she not see the current situation clearly? How could she not know that no matter how she fought with Hung Uzi, there would be no result in the end? The characteristics of the true sage mystiques would cause them to be entangled forever. Thus, it will be difficult for their true sage mystiques to be used on their opponents, unless they were willing to use the false sage mystiques to fight. However, since they had mastered more powerful mystiques, how could there be a victor if they used the false sage mystiques? Therefore, it could be said that the battle between the 2 of them had come to an end. There was no point in continuing. No wonder you guys didn't participate in the siege. It seems like things are going to be difficult, Shi Feng said to Jian Kuangzi after a while. Although the battle could not continue, it did not mean that Shi Feng would change her stance. It was still impossible for Hung Uzi and the others to gather many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and fuse them into a world. Similarly, it was impossible for Hung Uzi and the others to change their stance and give up on their original plan. It turned out that if they could fight, they would naturally rely on such a battle to determine the victor. However, no matter how they fought, there would not be a victor. How are they going to unify their thoughts? How are they going to resolve their conflict? As for why she said that it was reasonable for Jian Kuangzi not to participate in the siege, it was even simpler. The true sage mystiques were not determined by quantity. The difference between 1 true sage mystique and 1 true sage mystique and 2 true sage mystiques was not as great as other mystiques. In this way, whether they attacked at the same time or one of them attacked alone, to Shi Feng, there was not much difference. She could also use a true sage mystique to block it. Even if she could not block it, she could just use another one. Obviously, this was the truth. As a result, this kind of encirclement would not give them the advantage of encirclement. Naturally, there was no need to encircle them. I'm just afraid that the appearance of multiple true sage mystiques at the same time might make their battle infinitely larger. Jian Kuangzi smiled faintly. Hearing this, Shi Feng frowned, and a look of realization appeared in her eyes. Clearly, she understood what Jian Kuangzi meant. If there were 3 true sage mystiques, the 3rd true sage mystique will become an external force for the other 2 true sage mystiques. In this way, each of the 3 true sage mystiques would be stimulated by external forces at all times. The expansion of the scale was very likely to be endless. At that time, there was a high possibility that the entire universe would be destroyed. Whether it was Shi Feng or Hung Guzi, none of them could accept the complete destruction of the entire universe. Why don't we make a bet to determine the victor? Luo Fan suggested with a smile. Hun Guzi's words didn't receive any agreement from the trio. Hun Guzi said directly, "A bet is to entrust one's position to others. I will never do such a thing. Don't bring this matter up again, even if you lose the bet. Even if I lose the bet, I will never give up my position." Shi Feng was even more direct. "Don't mention such an impossible suggestion," Jin Guangzi said with a smile. Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly when he heard this. Previously, Hun Guzi and the other two did not have the demeanor of a sage, and he had unknowingly overlooked the fact that the three of them were false sages. As false sages, their willpower was far from what ordinary cultivators could compare to. Once they set their goal, it was almost impossible to change it. Unless they were defeated so that they could no longer persist, it was impossible to make them change their minds no matter what method was used. Gambling was something that often happened between cultivators who were usually difficult to determine the victor. Of course, it was impossible for it to happen between false saints. Any living being that was not a false saint was an ant in their eyes. Would a person place their hopes on whether they wanted to eat and what they wanted to eat on the leg of an ant? This was obviously impossible. Therefore, it could be said that Luo Fan's suggestion was obviously stupid. After discovering this, Luo Fan wisely shut his mouth and did not say anything else. Although Luo Fan did not speak, Hun Guzi and the others were unwilling to let him off the hook. Hun Guzi immediately asked, "Do you have any other ideas apart from the bet?" "I can't think of anything else. Fellow Taoist willpower is simply too strong. It's really as difficult as ascending to the heavens to shake them." Luo Fan sighed. Jin Guangzi was still unwilling to give up and said with a smile, "Since fellow Taoist can think of a method for the bet, I'm sure you can think of other methods as well. Let's hear it." Although Shi Feng was expressionless, from the way she looked at Luo Fan, it could be seen that she was also waiting for Luo Fan to come up with some creative ideas. Being stared at by the three of them like this, Luo Fan suddenly regretted his earlier words. These people actually completely put the responsibility on him. This was simply forcing a duck onto a perch. However, Luo Fan was obviously willing to go all out. He immediately said, "I really can't think of anything else. Please forgive me, fellow Taoists." As mentioned before, the false sage's willpower was very strong. Chapter 1500. Luo Fan was left speechless. He finally said helplessly, "It's just the three of you now. Do you think it's decided just because you guys decided? The three of you aren't the only false saints under the sages, right? What if the others don't agree?" Hun Guzi and the other two finally fell silent when they heard this. Although Luo Fan's words were an excuse to avoid being questioned by them, they had to admit that what Luo Fan said made sense. Although there were quite a number of false saints under the sages who had become false saints, there were far more than just the three of them who had survived. The three of them could only be considered the most ordinary existences among them. Even if the three of them reached a consensus here and the others disagreed, the consensus would be for naught. The final outcome would not be much different from now. Under such circumstances, it was clearly a little too early for the three of them to consider so much at this time. Indeed, that makes sense. Jin Guangzi sighed, but he seemed to be quite bored. Hun Guzi and Shi Feng's expressions also changed. Clearly, they also felt that Luo Fan's words made sense. However, before the others appear, there should be a solution, right? Hun Guzi continued. "You guys can think about it yourselves." Luo Fan was unwilling to meddle in their affairs at this time, so he immediately said. Hun Guzi and the other two were clearly not satisfied with Luo Fan's words. However, Luo Fan was unwilling to voice his opinion when they questioned him earlier. Now that he had a reason to shirk the responsibility, how could he voice his opinion? After asking for a while, they could only let it go. Could it be that we can only fight like this every time we encounter a false origin spiritual treasure? If that's the case, the universe will probably be completely destroyed soon, Hun Guzi said with a frown. "Let's fight," Shi Feng said indifferently. He seemed rather determined. He had no intention of giving in and compromising at all. He looked like he was completely determined to carry out his will. "Is that so? Bring it on then," Hun Guzi said indifferently. Clearly, his determination was not much weaker than Shitsi Feng's. Can you not be angry? Jin Kuangzi sighed. You're already a false saint. Why are you still so childish? Hun Guzi and Shitsi Feng fell into silence, neither of them saying a word. Luo Fan smiled faintly, but he felt that the feeling of watching a show was not bad. Previously, they were forcing him to find a way to put himself in that kind of headache-inducing situation. Now that they were in that kind of situation themselves, the feeling of watching from the sidelines was completely different. It was many times better. Then you think of a way. Hun Guzi paused. He turned to look at Jian Kuangzi and said. Jian Kuangzi opened his mouth and suddenly felt that he had been too talkative. He turned to look at Luo Fan and suddenly understood what Luo Fan had felt before. Although your standpoint is different from mine, and the solution I came up with might be biased toward your direction. However, I can still force myself to listen to it, Shitsi Feng continued. Jian Kuangzi fell silent. At this moment, the scale of the true Saint Mystique battlefield that Shitsi Feng and Hun Guzi had cast had stabilized. The scale of this battlefield naturally could not be expanded infinitely. After all, it was not a true Saint Mystique that was cast by a real sage. Although such a true Saint Mystique was extremely mysterious and contained incredible profoundness, it was impossible to fully unleash its power in the hands of a false saint. Therefore, as long as there was an area that could completely withstand the changes of the true Saint Mystique, the scale of the true Saint Mystique battlefield would also stabilize. However, the scale of the battlefield this time was already several times larger than the previous battles between the heavens and earth. It directly destroyed tens of thousands of major kiliocosm in the surroundings, turning them into unrecoverable world fragments. As for the layers of treasure light produced by the battle between the two true Saint Mystiques, it spread out almost without any restrictions. More and more worlds and heavens were enveloped by the treasure light that contained the aura of the true saint power. More and more false saints discovered the changes here in an instant from all directions. There were actually many heavens and earth that began to head towards this battlefield. This time, the treasure light produced by the battle between the two true Saint Mystiques was not concealed by the major kiliocosm. The area that it spread out was several times larger than the treasure light in the first battlefield. Previously, the treasure light did not cover many heavens and earth with sages, so there were not many heavens and earth condensing there. However, it was different here because the area where the treasure light accumulated had expanded a lot. Naturally, it attracted the attention of more false saints in the heavens and earth. With so many false saints paying attention, it was obvious that there were many sages who could not wait to come, even though this was clearly a battlefield. With the arrival of these heavens and earth, the number of false saints in this battlefield began to increase rapidly. The number of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures also increased rapidly. Hun Guzi and Jian Kuangzi's eyes burned with desire when they saw this change. One had to know that these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were their targets. However, although they were envious, looking at Shitsi Feng who was blocking in front of them, the two of them felt helpless. There was no longer a third true Saint Mystique in this area, whether it was Shitsi Feng or Hun Guzi's true Saint Mystique. However, if the two of them were to deal with those false saints and destroy those pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, Shitsi Feng would definitely stop them with his true Saint Mystique at all costs. That kind of result was not something they were willing to see. Luo Fan looked at the many heavens and earth and the many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures around him. He thought to himself, how many disciples of sages are there here? Just as he was thinking about this, a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure suddenly shot over from the many heavens and earth. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived beside Shitsi Feng. It condensed slightly and condensed into the figure of an old man. This old man had white hair and a youthful face. His long beard reached his chest, but he looked like an immortal. So it's you guys. What are you guys doing? After the old man appeared, He smiled at Hungu Zi and the other two. Seeing the appearance of this old man, Hungu Zi and Jian Kuangzi could not help but frown. Although Shi Feng's expression did not change, his attitude seemed to have relaxed a little. Such a change. Luo Fan could tell at a glance that this old man was also a disciple of a sage. Moreover, his standpoint was obviously similar to Shi Feng's. Even if there were some differences, there would not be too much of conflict. True form, I didn't expect you to be hiding like Shi Feng. Hungu Zi frowned. Isn't that normal? I am very satisfied with my current life, but I don't want it to be broken. The true form laughed. So, fellow Taoist, is also a disciple of a sage. I am Luo Fan. May I know which sage you are a disciple of? Luo Fan said with a smile. The true form looked at Luo Fan and instantly saw through Luo Fan's current strength. He did not dare to be negligent. He smiled and said, so it's fellow Taoist Luo Fan. I am a disciple of the Supreme Sage, Primordial Lord of Heaven. Could it be that fellow Taoist is not a disciple of a sage? Although my strength is weak, I believe I have seen most of the disciples of sages. Why haven't I seen fellow Taoist before? Luo Fan smiled and said, I'm not a disciple of a sage. Hearing this, true form couldn't help but be in awe. Not a disciple of a sage can actually cultivate to this level. Fellow Taoist ability is 100 times better than mine. You flatter me. How can I compare to fellow Taoist? Luo Fan only smiled. Their conversation had dispersed much of the tense atmosphere that had been present on the scene. True form, your standpoint still hasn't changed? Hungu Zi asked. Hearing this, true form chuckled. Isn't that for sure? Could it be? Fellow Taoist's standpoint has changed? Hearing this, Hungu Zi and Jian Kuangzi were not disappointed. After all, a false sage's will was so firm that even the most stubborn person couldn't be compared to it. Once it was decided, it was almost impossible to change. As a false sage, how could true form's standpoint change so easily? Therefore, true form's answer was outside of Hungu Zi's expectations. However, Hungu Zi clearly didn't have any expectations for this. He only asked that question to start a conversation. After hearing true form's answer, he said, I believe you can see the current situation clearly. Do you have a way to unify our opinions? Hearing this, Jian Kuang Zi quickly agreed. That's right. This matter is very important. Fellow Taoist true form is very knowledgeable and must know many ways. Quickly come up with 100 or so that the world doesn't fall into danger. He was being forced to think of a way before. Now that true form came up to him to take over the pressure, how could he not be proactive? True form was also a false sage and a disciple of sage. He obviously knew some true sage god art. Although he had only arrived for a short while, he had already seen through the current situation with a single glance. He knew how awkward the situation was at this moment. When he heard the words of the two of them, he frowned and said, There's nothing I can do. Why are you hiding it? You must have a way. Hurry up and say it. If you don't have 100, at least 8 or 10. Jian Kuangzi said, I really don't have a way. We're all people with strong wills. As long as we have the ability, we will carry out our will. We won't sit by and watch the changes we don't want to see happen. Therefore, all the ways, in the end, it all comes down to power. If that's the case, clearly, we will fall into this awkward situation again. So, this is an unsolvable problem. Truth realization master side. Isn't what we do most often to turn the impossible into the possible? Fellow Taoist must have a way. Jian Kuangzi said without hesitation. Who here didn't know the difficulty true form mentioned? Wasn't it because of this that they had a headache and didn't know how to solve their conflict? If it was easy, why would they force true form to think of a way? At this moment, Hungu Zi also chimed in and asked Truth Transformation Master to come up with a solution. In fact, even Shi Feng was looking at him expectantly. This made true form smile bitterly. If I don't have a way, then I don't have one. Are you going to force me to think of a way? There must be a way. How can there be an unsolvable problem in the world? Fellow Taoist, think again. No matter how absurd it is, you can suggest it. We can discuss and improve. Jian Kuangzi obviously didn't give up. He immediately took out the method he used to force Luo Fan to answer and kept chattering in the true Transformation Master's ear, making him think of a way. This made true Transformation Realm very helpless. Luo Fan looked at everything happening. He suddenly felt it was funny. His status before was probably about the same as the current true Realization Master. At this moment, a voice sounded, Dao Fringe Truth Transformation Z, Martial Artist Phone, Hungu Z, Jin Kwang Z, and this unknown Dao friend. Why are you all so interested in watching a true divine battle? At this moment, a voice sounded. Everyone turned around and saw a young man walking over curiously from the depths of the void. This man's entire body was surrounded by a strong aura that only a false sage could have. It was eternal and indestructible. There was a magic treasure that looked like a giant pair of scissors floating above his head. From time to time, strands of the great Tao would fall from the magic treasure and enter the man's body. The great Tao would then surge out of the man's body and into the magic treasure. During this process, the man maintained the might of a false saint, the aura of a false saint, and the status of a false saint. Obviously, however, he had used a different method from everyone present to allow himself to break through the shackles of this world that prevented him from becoming a false saint. They would be able to unleash the power of a pseudo-sage even outside of the world. They would also be able to possess the ability to be indestructible, invincible, and omnipotent. Seeing this man arrive, Teacher Feng, True Form, Hungu Z, and Jianquang Z all frowned slightly. Obviously, they didn't welcome this man's appearance. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan suddenly became curious. Could it be that this man did not stand on the side of either of them? Or could it be that this man's personality was similar to the previous Battle God Sun? Did he offend everyone like Battle God Sun? Did he make every sage's disciples extremely unhappy with him? Why are you here? Are you here to stir shit again? Hungu Z said with a frown. At this moment, Jian Kwang Z saw Luo Fan's confused expression and explained to him, "This is the disciple of the Heavenly Lord of Primordial Beginning. His name is Jing Yitzi. Don't be fooled by his calm name, but he's really a troublemaker. He doesn't have any standpoint when he does things, and he changes almost all the time." Hearing this, Luo Fan came to a realization. It seemed that this man had completely taken into account the two possibilities that he had guessed. Not only was he not on the same side as them, but he was also quite annoying as a person. In this case, it was no wonder that the disciples of the four sages had such expressions. However, True Transformation Master suddenly thought of something and smiled. "Junior brother Jing Yitzi, you came at the right time. There's a difficult problem that needs your unconventional thinking. Are you interested?" True Transformation Master was also the disciple of the Heavenly Lord of Primordial Beginning, and so was Jing Yitzi. Although they didn't have much interaction due to the long time difference, they were still disciples and had a closer relationship with each other than others. That was why he called Jing Yitzi Junior Brother. It seems that this problem is very difficult. Otherwise, why would Senior Brother True Transformation Master speak to me in such a polite tone? Jing Yitzi chuckled. True Transformation Master acted as if he didn't hear this at all. His expression didn't change at all. He smiled. "Junior brother, you misunderstood. This problem is very difficult for us, but it's definitely extremely easy for you to solve. I wonder if Junior brother is interested in hearing it?" As a false sage, he had cultivated for billions of years. What hadn't he experienced? What hadn't he heard? How could his expression change because of this little provocation? Is there even a need to say it? The only thing that can make you guys so troubled, and even a SH*T stirrer like me is willing to smile at you, is obviously solving the conflict between you guys. Jing Yitzi said nonchalantly. He was also a false sage. Even if his personality was a bit weird, it didn't mean that he was worse than other false sages. His thinking speed was very fast. With just one glance, he naturally knew what was troubling everyone. Coupled with his mentality as a fake saint, he naturally knew what everyone was worried about. Hearing this, True Transformation Master's expression stiffened. Clearly, he didn't expect this junior brother, who was like a sh*t stirrer, to think of everything so quickly. He knew that his plan of thinking of a solution wouldn't succeed. After Jing Yitzi said that, he no longer cared about true transformation master and turned to look at the battlefield where the two true sage god arts were fighting. He said with interest, "I didn't expect the battle between true sage god arts to have such an effect. This is beyond my expectations. If I had known earlier, I would have tried it long ago. That way, perhaps it would have been more fun." Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood Jing Yitzi's bad personality a little. Suddenly, Jing Yitzi changed the topic and said, "However, if you guys are stumped by such a small problem, then you guys are really too useless." Saying such a sentence made everyone feel unhappy and expectant in their hearts. Oh, could it be that Dao Friend has a solution? This time, it wasn't true Transformation Master who asked, but Hungazi. Of course, what's so difficult about it? I don't even know what you guys are thinking about. This is such a simple problem. It's almost obvious with one look. You guys are actually troubled here. It's really... As Jing Yitzi spoke, his face revealed an expression of sorrow for his misfortune and anger for his failure to live up to his expectations. That kind of appearance was really asking for a beating. At this time, Luo Fan also became curious. In his mind, this was a rather troublesome problem. How could Jing Yitzi say that it was a simple matter? However, it was a pity that Jing Yitzi's performance once again gave him a direct understanding of her vile character. He completely ignored Hanguzi and the others' expectant expressions. He just kept pointing out how bad they were, how narrow-minded they were, and how rigid their brains were. He kept saying how simple the problem was, and how easily he found the solution. But he just didn't say how the problem should be solved. At this moment, even Luo Fan was already feeling irritated, let alone Hanguzi and the others who were closely related to the solution to this problem. Their expressions became even more unsightly. If it wasn't for their strong self-control, perhaps Jing Yitzi would have already been besieged by them. No wonder he's disliked everywhere. This thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. After a long time, Jing Yitzi seemed to be satisfied with his previous scolding. His face was full of a relaxed and satisfied smile as he said, "It's very simple to solve this problem." Hearing this, Hungazi and the others didn't look forward to it at all. Jing Yitzi had said the same thing countless times before, but every time they were filled with anticipation, he would change the topic and describe how simple the problem was, and how stupid it was to not be able to think of a solution. However, Jing Yitzi obviously wouldn't act according to everyone's expectations. When they didn't have the slightest expectation, he directly said, "To solve this problem, we only need to report to Master and ask Master to create a battlefield for us to fight. The loser can't leave, and only the winner can leave. Wouldn't that solve the problem?" Hearing this, Hungazi and the others were stunned. It wasn't just because they didn't have time to react when Jing Yitzi directly set out his solution. It was also because the solution was so simple and feasible. The true divine sacred ability was an unsolvable problem for them. In order to prevent the true divine sacred ability's destructive power from increasing infinitely, they could only prevent more than 3 true divine sacred abilities from appearing at the same time. This made it difficult to determine the winner of the battle between them, and it made it no difference whether they had more people or fewer people. However, this was only for them. For a real sage, limiting the destructive power of a true divine sacred ability couldn't be any easier. As long as a true divine was willing, he could easily create a battlefield that the true divine sacred ability couldn't break through. That would obviously solve all their problems. Chapter 1501. I didn't expect you to come up with the answer. Perhaps only someone like you could come up with this answer. The true transformation master sighed. Jing Yitzi raised his eyebrows and said, "Senior brother, I don't like what you said. What do you mean only someone like me could come up with the answer?" The true transformation master chuckled and did not reply. Instead, he smiled and said to Hanguzi and the others, "What do you guys think of this method? It's feasible." Teacher Feng said. Jian Kuangzi also nodded at this moment, indicating that he agreed with this method. However, although they already had an idea on how to resolve this dispute, It did not mean that they had to act immediately. There were only a few people here, and compared to the many disciples of the sages in the various worlds, they were really insignificant. Under such circumstances, even if they begged the sages to create a battlefield, would they be able to start? If any of the disciples of the sages disagreed with this method and did not accept this method, this decision would obviously be in vain. As long as the disciple of the sage who grasped the true divine God art was unwilling to accept this solution, his true divine God art would become the fatal weakness of the decision to resolve the dispute. Then, the situation would be no different from the situation at this very moment. Therefore, it was obvious that before all the disciples of the sages were gathered, it was obviously impossible to ask the sages to create a battlefield and place them in it. Hunguzi and the others were very clear about this point. At this moment, no one had any doubts about this. Immediately, everyone discussed and decided to work together to first open up a world as a place for them to stay. Then, each of them went to invite the disciples of the sages that they knew to come and discuss this matter together. The efficiency of the false sage was obviously extremely shocking. Since it had already been decided, naturally no one was willing to delay. They immediately left the battlefield and arrived at a place of nothingness where there were no saints around. They directly brushed away the vast 1,000 worlds that existed in this region. A relatively spacious area was used as a place for them to open up a world. For a false sage, opening up a world was really an extremely simple matter. Even if it was a great 1,000 world, they could open up hundreds of millions of them with a wave of their hand. However, it was clear that this could not be used here at this moment, because the world they needed to open up was not an ordinary boundless world. In fact, it was not even a powerful world with sages. Such a world, such a heaven and earth, could not support the existence of false sages like them. If they entered it, the heaven and earth would naturally collapse and be destroyed. Therefore, it was not an easy task for them to work together to open up this world. It was not a process that could end quickly. All of them were disciples of the sages. Although they had different standpoints, they had no choice but to fight. However, there was still quite a bit of friendship between them. Now that they had agreed on a solution, they no longer opposed each other. Now that they had opened up the world together, they naturally had to discuss and discuss with each other, using their common wisdom to solve this problem. In the end, they came up with a solution. That was to open up a world without a truly stable great Tao. The size of this world, its strength was variable. When it had just taken shape, it might appear extremely weak or even be at the level of an ordinary boundless world. However, if a false sage stepped into it through a special method, the great Tao would naturally be able to obtain the support of the great Tao fragments that the false sage possessed. From there, it would grow greatly and eventually grow to the point where it could accommodate its existence. In other words, such a world would become stronger as the number of false sages that entered increased. The more false sages there were, the stronger the world would be. In this way, naturally, no matter how many great Tao fragments the false sage had or how strong he was, stepping into it would not cause the world to collapse and be destroyed, of course. Only a false sage could open up such a world. Although this was only a simple idea, there were countless difficult problems in it. If it was an ordinary cultivator, even if they thought of this, they would definitely not be able to solve the many difficulties. Only an almost omnipotent existence like a false sage could use their wisdom that had reached the level of a false sage to solve the many problems one by one. The few false sages discussed for a while, and the many difficulties were solved by them one by one. It didn't take long for them to understand the method of opening up the world. Luo Fan also took part in this, but he also carried a part of the task. This kind of efficiency in solving problems, I'm afraid that the mortals in the secular world will go crazy with jealousy. Luo Fan watched as they took out the world creation method, which was so mysterious that even he found it hard to believe. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Fellow Taoists, are you ready? Hun Guzi asked everyone. I'm ready, Luo Fan said with a smile. Jian Kuangzi, Shitzi Feng, Zhen Huazi, and even Jing Yitzi expressed that they were ready. Seeing this, Hun Guzi no longer hesitated. He raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, a mysterious existence that seemed to be a great Tao, but also seemed to be different from the real great Tao, rushed out from the mist formed by the great Tao fragments behind him. It instantly circled in the void in front of him, and with a slight tremble, a mysterious great Tao was born. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that his mission had come. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and slapped towards the void. With this slap, his body formed by the divine court heaven cauldron suddenly shook, and the layers of great Tao fragments in the divine court heaven cauldron were slapped out by him. The projections of these great Tao fragments were just products derived from the great Tao. However, they contained many characteristics of the fragments. After being arranged in an extremely subtle and special way by Luo Fan, they would possess some kind of indescribable power. They could change the great Tao that had just been born, allowing it to have some kind of flexible ability. The projection of his great Tao fragments circled around the newly born great Tao in an extremely special way. During this process, it constantly bombarded the great Tao, constantly changing its nature and information. Gradually, it completely integrated into the great Tao. As these great Tao projections integrated into it, the great Tao seemed to have become rubber. It seemed to have some kind of elasticity that did not exist before. After this, Jin Kuangzi suddenly raised his hand and slapped towards the great Tao. This slap, there seemed to be countless rays of spiritual light rushing out from his hand. Each of these rays of spiritual light was extremely fine, and they were densely stacked together. However, they seemed like billions of rays of light, appearing very blurry. These billions of rays of spiritual light seemed to have substance. There seemed to be countless flashes of light and shadows in it, and it also emitted a supreme, eternal, and indestructible aura that only a false saint could emit. The spiritual light directly crossed the void and poured into the newly born great Tao. During this process, it began to expand crazily. In the blink of an eye, it had already expanded the great Tao to billions of times its original size. If it was not for the fact that there was no concept of space in the void, no matter how big the great Tao was, it would not have made any difference to them, and they would not have been oppressed by the lack of space. Therefore, they did not need to escape just because the great Tao had suddenly expanded so much. Of course, this was not the end of the changes. After the great Tao was expanded to this extent, it suddenly began to shrink. In the blink of an eye, it had already shrunk to a few 100 million of its original size. It seemed to be completely insignificant, to the point where one could even completely ignore it if they were not careful. And so on and so forth. This great Tao seemed to contain some kind of frequency that even Luo Fan could not completely understand, and it constantly expanded and shrank. Every time it expanded and shrank, the great Tao seemed to undergo some kind of subtle change. Just like this, in just a few days, the great Tao had already expanded and shrank hundreds of millions of times. When the final change was completed, the great Tao had completely returned to its original size. But compared to its original appearance, it had clearly undergone some kind of indescribable change again. After Jin Kuangzi completed this process, Shi Feng took over the task. Compared to Luo Fan and the others who directly raised their hands to slap it, Shi Feng waved her sleeves, and in an instant, endless spiritual light rushed out from her sleeves. It turned into a long river in the void and suddenly rushed into the great Tao. Compared to the countless tiny spiritual lights that Jin Kuangzi had released before, this river of spiritual light was also at the false sage level, but its performance was completely different. There seemed to be endless living beings within this river of spiritual light. It was as if each speck of spiritual light was a powerful living being, or rather, a powerful cultivator. The entire river of spiritual light looked as if it was formed from countless spiritual light creatures. As it moved forward in the void, it looked as if the river of history was surging forward from the distant past to the future, countless years later. After entering the great Tao, there was no change on the surface of the great Tao. It was like a clay ox entering the sea, and there was no reaction at all. However, this was only on the surface, which of the people present didn't have earth-shattering insight. Everyone could clearly feel that some kind of indescribable instinct seemed to have been born within the great Tao. This instinct was extremely high level, almost reaching the false sage level. Under such instincts, the great Tao seemed to have turned from an inanimate object into a living being. At this moment, the true transformation master also started to move. He pointed with his finger, and endless gray air currents surged out from his finger. They crossed the void and wrapped around the great Tao. Every insignificant speck of energy contained in the gray airflow contained enough energy to kill a pseudo-sage cultivator long ago. Right now, this gray stream of air was as large as a long river. One could imagine how much energy it contained. The instant the gray air currents wrapped around the great Tao was like a field that had been dry for a long time. It started to crazily devour the gray air currents. In a few days, the air currents were devoured until not a single drop was left. Then, a layer of strange existence started to wrap around the great Tao. That layer of strange existence was extremely mysterious and profound. It seemed to be time and space. It also seemed to be a layer of laws, but it also seemed to be absolute nothingness. It was Ming Ming. After the true transformation master did all this, Jing Yitzi also started to move. He first smiled. Then he opened his mouth and spat out a mysterious sound wave. The sound wave was extremely mysterious. It didn't have the formless and intangible appearance of ordinary sound waves. On the contrary, it seemed incomparably real. It was even comparable to the spirit light, chi flow, and grand Tao fragment projection from true Master Hua and the others. They seemed to be the sound of the great Tao, but at the same time, they seemed to be simple roars. They seemed to be the supreme truth that could allow any living being to attain the Tao. But at the same time, they seemed to be mere noises these sound waves poured into the unseen world. It poured into the great path, instantly causing it to shake violently. In an instant, it began to spread to both sides, directly penetrating into the depths of the darkness. It became an unknown beginning and an unknown, and immediately after, the rules and laws began to spread out from the great path. Space-time also began to appear layer by layer above the rules and laws. This process lasted for several days. A few days later, the great Tao was faintly discernible. It was already completely covered by the layer of laws and the layer of space-time. Obviously, heaven and earth had truly taken shape, but it was no longer the simple great Tao that it originally had. After completing this step, Jing Yitzi closed his mouth and stopped the powerful sound waves that were being emitted from his mouth. When he stopped, the heaven and earth also truly stabilized. This was a strange world. This world was empty. There was only a pure, complete structure of space-time, the layer of laws, and the great Tao. Apart from that, there was no other matter. Whether it was the earth, ocean, mountains, rivers, or even the sun, moon, stars, or clouds in the sky, there was nothing. The inside of this world was completely empty. Rather than saying it was a world, it was more like a storage space. Let me try. Jing Yitzi smiled. Then, without waiting for the others to reply, he stepped into the world first. In an instant, the world trembled slightly. The great Tao in the unseen world began to sprout and grow rapidly. At the same time, the scenery of the world also began to change rapidly. A continent and an ocean began to appear in the world, and a starry sky began to appear in the sky. The strength of the world also began to increase rapidly at this moment. In the blink of an eye, it felt like it was not much weaker than any world that could give birth to a sage. Looks like it's a success. Jing Yitzi took a deep breath and let out a long sigh before he smiled and said to everyone. At this moment, he was already hovering in the sky above the continent that had just been born. He was looking down at the continent below, as if he was carefully sensing the mysteries of this world. Seeing the changes in the world after he entered, Luo Fan and the others heaved a sigh of relief. This situation clearly meant that this world was already halfway to success. The remaining half would depend on whether this world would collapse if more false sages entered it. Hun Guzi thought for a moment and said, "Then I'll be the second." As he spoke, without waiting for the others to reply, he lifted his foot and stepped into the world. As he entered, the world began to tremble slightly, and there seemed to be cracking sounds coming from all over the world. How could Jing Yitzi compare to the great Tao fragments that Hun Guzi had collected? At this moment, the great Tao that he possessed was equivalent to 4 or 5 worlds that could give birth to sages. When he stepped into this world in this state, the pressure that he exerted on the world was clearly something that Jing Yitzi could not compare to. Seeing such a change in the world, everyone could not help but frown slightly. Could it be that he had failed? Could it be that even Hun Guzi, a false sage who had collected more great Tao fragments, could not withstand it? However, it turned out that their worries were unfounded. Amidst the crackling sounds, the great Tao in the world began to grow rapidly like a balloon, and the law layer of the world began to expand rapidly. The space-time of the world began to grow rapidly during this process. Apart from that, not far away from Jing Yitzi, a continent that was dozens of times larger than the one that Jing Yitzi was on formed out of thin air in the sky. A starry sky that was also dozens of times larger naturally appeared, directly crushing the starry sky that was formed when Jing Yitzi entered, not long after. Heaven and earth stabilized. That heaven and earth, vaguely, it had already surpassed the normal world that could give birth to a saint. It floated in the void, but it was as eye-catching as the sun. It vaguely captured more and more great thousand worlds in the surroundings, making those great thousand worlds seem like satellites that started to gather around this world. Under normal circumstances, it was obvious that a world that could give birth to a saint would only have a fortuitous encounter. At this moment, being able to appear above this world clearly meant that this world had reached the level of a world that could give birth to a saint. At this point, it was obvious that they could announce that the world that they had spent more than 10 days to create was completely in line with their expectations, and it could really become a place for them to stay. Seeing this, Luo Fan and the others no longer hesitated and immediately stepped into the world. As the 4 of them entered one after another, the world once again grew by leaps and bounds amidst a series of cracking sounds that made their teeth ache. Whether it was the great Tao, space-time, or the law of rules, they had all grown to a level that far surpassed the world that could normally give birth to sages. Within that world, 4 more continents had appeared. Among them, True Transformation Z and Jian Quangzi's continents were only similar to Jing Yitzi's, but Luo Fan and Shi Feng's continents far surpassed Jing Yitzi's. Between them, Luo Fan's continent was much larger than Shi Feng's continent. Although it was still slightly smaller than Han Guzi's continent, the disparity was definitely not as great as Jing Yitzi's continent. As for the starry sky in the sky, it was now densely packed, no longer as empty as it was at the beginning. He could feel that time was incredibly stable. The space was incredibly stable, and the great Tao was incredibly vast. Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. It's a pity that the growth of a perfect world requires the growth of its essence, and not just the accumulation of the great Tao. Otherwise, this world would probably be comparable to a perfect world. In terms of all aspects, this world was actually not inferior to Earth's universe. However, it still belonged to the category of the colossal world, and it was still much weaker than a perfect world. This was not a difference in quantity, but a difference in quality. Unless it could attract the refinement of the Great Tribulation like the world created by Luo Fan and the Holy Venerable, even if this world grew tens of thousands of times and every aspect strengthened tens of thousands of times, it would still be within the category of the colossal world. It would not be a perfect world, and it would not be able to exist eternally in the state of chaos. This was the limitation of the world's essence. When he thought of this, he recalled what Hun Guzi had said, and he could not help but feel even more puzzled. A world like this can give birth to a true saint that can exist independently in the state of chaos? How is that possible? In a world that could not even come into contact with the state of chaos, It did not seem plausible that an existence that could travel freely in the state of chaos and not be harmed by it could be born. However, Hun Guzi's information came from the venerable Grand Mist ancestor, so he could not help but feel puzzled. After the few of them settled in this world, the world was filled with vitality, and gradually, living beings were born. However, Hun Guzi and the others only treated this world as a place to stay, and they had no intention of managing it. Therefore, they let the vitality fill the world, but did not urge it to condense into living beings, nor did they speed up time so that the world would develop into a state of vitality as soon as possible. They just watched the world evolve naturally and slowly. Chapter 1502. Pure text online reading website, domain name, font color equals red, squinting eyes face, B. Mobile phone synchronization. Please visit after they settle down. They did not say much. Jing Yitzi sat there quietly and watched with a faint smile, but the others each emitted rays of spiritual light and left this world. These spiritual lights contain a kind of charm that belonged to true sages, but they were emitted from the power they had mastered. This kind of spiritual light contained a large amount of information. Obviously, it was what they relied on to summon the disciples of the sages who were on the same side as them. Although they had previously said that they wanted to invite people from the same side, it was obvious that with their strength and realm, they did not need to go to every place, nor did they need to personally meet with every disciple of the sages. They only needed to attach their thoughts to the spiritual light and send it out. Naturally, they would be able to let the disciples of the other sages understand their intentions and naturally invite them over. The 4 disciples of the sages, Jian Kuangzi, Teacher Feng, and Tru Huazi, belonged to 2 different camps. For the sake of their own camp, they naturally needed to invite as many disciples of the sages as possible. Therefore, they were especially proactive and sprinkled spiritual lights like rain. As for Jing Yitzi and Luo Fan, one was a troublemaker, while the other had little to do with the sages and was not related to this matter. Naturally, there was no need for them to contact the other sages. Under such circumstances, the 2 of them naturally did not need to emit spiritual lights. After these spiritual lights were emitted, the world fell into a state of silence. The 5 false sages had no intention of speaking at this moment. As for Luo Fan, needless to say, his relationship with the others was not deep. This was not the time to build a relationship, so there was naturally nothing much to say. At this moment, he was floating above his own land and guarding his mind. However, he was carrying out a task that he had already done previously, which was to completely fuse the divine court heaven cauldron with his body. He wanted the divine court heaven cauldron to become his true body and the vast great Tao inside the divine court heaven cauldron to become inseparable from him, an existence that no one could compare to. Thus, what he had now, he would no longer be able to lose the false sage. Compared to watching the show, this matter was more important to him. It was precisely because he recognized this that he completely ignored the various evolutions taking place on the boundless continent below him, and he didn't care about the creatures that were gradually being born. He didn't care about the subtle adjustments that were going on in this process. To completely destroy a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure with such a large number of great Tao fragments. Completely fusing it with one's own body was obviously an extremely huge project. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he wanted to do this, it was by no means an easy task. In fact, whether he could succeed or not depended on how he did it. After guarding his mind, his body floating above the continent began to transform. In the blink of an eye, he had turned into a 3-legged cauldron. It was the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. After it turned into the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, strands of karma began to spread out from it. The karma wrapped around it and seemed to form a net, but it did not seem to have reached that stage yet. It was just spreading out. This was the power of the true sage mystique that Luo Fan had mastered. This kind of power was clearly many times weaker than the power of his true sage mystique in actual combat. It was even far inferior to the complete false sage mystique. However, it had a special characteristic. If it was triggered by an external force, it would naturally activate the preparations that Luo Fan had placed on it, causing the true sage mystique to erupt. This was a trick to using the true sage mystique, but it was essentially the same as the spiritual light that Guzi and the others had added with the characteristics of the true sage to summon the disciples of the other sages. It was just that the emphasis was different. This defensive method was clearly the most powerful defense that Luo Fan could display at the moment. With such a method, no matter how many false sages there were, or even how many disciples of the sages were interested in his heavenly cauldron, it would be impossible for them to seize the great Tao fragments contained in the heavenly cauldron, unless this world became the battlefield that they had requested the sages to set up, and the disciples of the sages could use the true sage mystique to carry it out. The true sage mystique itself had an absolute characteristic. For existences that had yet to become a true sage, possessing such a mystique meant that they were naturally invincible. Even if there were other true sage mystiques, no matter how many there were, it would be difficult for them to truly suppress it. With such a defense, it could be said that there was no need to worry about Luo Fan's safety at all. However, even so, it did not mean that Luo Fan would have no worries in the future. After all, there were still places in this world that Guzi and the others had requested true sages to turn into the battlefield that they wanted. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan did not relax at all. After restoring the divine quartz heaven cauldron to its original form, his consciousness returned to his body. In other words, in the void inside the heavenly cauldron, he was standing above the complete peak formed by countless great Tao fragments. Looking down at the mysterious and indescribably wonderful great Tao below, Luo Fan could not help but let out a long sigh. If he wanted to completely refine this magic treasure and fuse it with his body, the first step was to completely master the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, which was the vast great Tao beneath his feet. The place where he was at was actually a natural creation of the great path around him. In the unseen world, every time he made a move, he would be greatly influenced by the great Tao. Of course, at the same time, he who was sufficiently powerful would affect the grand Tao with every breath and every action he took, causing the grand Tao to undergo an indescribable change with every single one of his actions. His heart skipped a beat. Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward, his body slowly walking into the great Tao. If he were anywhere else, he would be courting death if he dared to walk into the great Tao like this. Even if the great Tao was not the kind of great Tao that could give birth to saints, but only a great Tao, his actions would only cause the great Tao to collapse. There would not be any other consequences. However, facing this great Tao, the situation was different. This great Tao was formed bit by bit from the great Tao fragments that Luo Fan had collected and condensed. Luo Fan was equivalent to the creator of this great Tao. He was equivalent to the master of this great Tao. Not to mention that this great Tao had completely fused with the heavenly cauldron that he had completely refined, and this great Tao had already deeply belonged to him. Under such circumstances, he walked into the great Tao. Obviously, it would not be like walking into other great Tao. Not only would it not cause a strong conflict with the great Tao, or would destroy the great Tao, or it would be destroyed by the great Tao. Instead, it was as if he had returned to his mother's body, and an incomparably warm feeling arose spontaneously. The great Tao was formed from the endless, purest, and most profound principles and mysteries. It was an extremely mysterious existence. However, it could not be described as anything else. When Luo Fan walked into it, he felt as if he was surrounded by some kind of endless characteristics. It was as if he was surrounded by ice water, warm water, hot water, magma, concentrated sulfuric acid, aqua regia, blades, poisonous fog, and so on. There were countless contradictions, and everything that could be found and imagined in the universe that shouldn't have appeared at the same time. These contradictory feelings should have made him feel extremely uncomfortable. However, at this moment, he did not feel uncomfortable at all. Instead, it was as if all these changes could only make him feel comfortable and carefree, and he was almost addicted to it. The great Tao was boundless, and he did not know where it ended. Stepping into it was like stepping into another world, another world. He could only see endless abstract or concrete lights and shadows constantly changing, but he could not see any changes outside of the great Tao. In fact, even his connection with the heavenly cauldron seemed to be cut off by this great Tao. If an ordinary person could step into this place like me, they would definitely be able to ascend to the sky. Luo Fan looked around and could not help but sigh. Everything in this great Tao contained endless principles and mysteries. Just taking a breath would allow one to comprehend some kind of mysteries, and one could even obtain a false sage Tao. If an ordinary person stepped into this place and took a breath, they might be able to directly break through layers of shackles and become a false sage. If a level 9 false sage or a supreme venerable could directly enter this place and become a false sage, it would be almost certain. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan did not stop at all. He walked towards the depths of the great Tao step by step. The entire great Tao was boundless. If he used an ordinary method, he might not be able to walk through the entire great Tao, even if he walked for hundreds of millions of years. He might not even be able to reach the depths that he wanted to reach. Therefore, although Luo Fan seemed to be walking normally at this moment, there were actually countless profound changes in the process of walking. Every step he took was treading on some kind of strange path on the great Tao. Almost every step he took was equivalent to the distance that he would need to spend billions or even trillions of years to traverse if he were to advance using the ordinary method. Just like that, he still walked for several years before reaching the depths of this great Tao. At least, it was the depths that he wanted to reach, as a great Tao that was several times more vast than the great Tao that could give birth to a false sage. This great Tao contained countless mysteries of the false sage Tao. Along the way, Luo Fan saw hundreds of millions of false sage Tao floating in this great Tao. Almost any of these Tao of false sage could be turned into a false sage mystique as long as it could be taken out and slightly modified. It could naturally make any existence below the false sage invincible after obtaining it. However, Luo Fan did not care much about these false sage Tao. He only took a glance at each false sage Tao at most, and he did not even have the intention to continue, let alone comprehend these false sage Tao. These false sage Tao were broad and profound, and each of them was enough for him to comprehend for endless years. If he were to comprehend them one by one, he might not be able to comprehend them even when the entire Earth and universe were completely destroyed. In this situation, where there were more important things waiting for him to do, it was obviously not a wise choice to spend endless time comprehending these false sage Tao. When he arrived at the depth that he wanted to reach, Luo Fan let out a long breath. It's here indeed. At this moment, standing in front of him. However, it was not the same scene in the great Tao that he had seen in the past few years. Instead, there was a three-legged round cauldron floating in midair. This three-legged round cauldron was obviously the divine quartz heaven cauldron. However, compared to the divine quartz heaven cauldron outside, this divine quartz heaven cauldron seemed purer. It outlined every line of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. They were all false sage Tao. Every single pattern and twist on it was the Tao of a false sage. The entire divine quartz heaven cauldron. It was as if it was completely condensed from a false sage Tao. Such a divine quartz heaven cauldron floated in midair and naturally emitted an unimaginable mystery. It felt as if it was even more mysterious than the surrounding great Tao. This was none other than the projection of the divine quartz heaven cauldron in the great Tao. It could also be said that it was the product of the complete fusion of the great Tao and the divine quartz heaven cauldron. In other words, this divine quartz heaven cauldron actually corresponded to the entire great Tao. Every detail and every key point on it reflected the entire great Tao. Or, to be more specific, this divine quartz heaven cauldron could actually be considered another form of the great Tao. What Luo Fan needed to do now was obviously to completely fuse his body with it, or to completely shatter the divine quartz heaven cauldron and fuse it into his body. His body would completely replace the divine quartz heaven cauldron and become the reflection of the great Tao. Or, he would completely shatter his body and fuse it into the divine quartz heaven cauldron. From then on, he would completely change the appearance of the divine quartz heaven cauldron and make it his body. Either of these two methods could achieve what he wanted. He wanted the divine quartz heaven cauldron to completely become his body. From then on, it would become a part of him that was inseparable from him and would never be taken away. The difficulty of both methods were the same. Both were unimaginably difficult. Therefore, it did not matter which method was easy or which was difficult. With a move of his heart, Luo Fan chose the method he liked more. That was to directly shatter the divine quartz heaven cauldron and fuse it into every part of his body. Although there was no difference in essence, doing so was equivalent to devouring an external object. It would feel like his body was still his body. In comparison, shattering his body and fusing it into the divine quartz heaven cauldron would give him the feeling that he had become a part of the divine quartz heaven cauldron, and not the other way around. Although this feeling was very ridiculous and did not seem to make much sense. However, since doing so would make him feel a little uncomfortable, it would naturally be a reason for him not to choose after making up his mind. Luo Fan did not hesitate. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure fell into the divine quartz heaven cauldron. The divine quartz heaven cauldron was thousands of feet tall, so it was really easy for it to accommodate Luo Fan. Compared to the main body of this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, there were no strange changes inside the divine quartz heaven cauldron. It was just the interior of a three-legged round cauldron. There was no other space, nor was there anything special. There were only countless patterns on the inner walls of the three-legged round cauldron that were condensed and outlined by countless Tao. After Luo Fan sat down inside the three-legged round cauldron, he began to slowly circulate his power and slowly seep into the cauldron. He slowly began to fuse with the patterns on the inner and outer walls of the three-legged round cauldron. The Tao of the false saint was deep and unfathomable. Even if it was Luo Fan, it was almost like a mortal moving a mountain when he wanted to fuse his power with it. He felt that every bit of progress required him to exhaust all of his potential, and he needed to fully unleash all of his power. Every time his power seeped into those patterns, he could feel that the connection between the entire Tao and him was a little tighter. He could also feel that the connection between the divine quartz heaven cauldron and him was also a little tighter. However, this progress was extremely slow. It was extremely difficult, but at least it proved that his plan was correct. This method could indeed completely fuse the divine quartz heaven cauldron into his body. Seeping his power into the patterns on the surface was only the first step. When all the patterns, or in other words, all the other Daos were completely permeated by his power, the next step was to go a step further and completely permeate all the internal structure of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. Then, all the structures would establish an extremely close connection with him, just like the patterns after that. What he needed to do was to completely collapse it and finally absorb it into his body. The entire process, of course, such a process, obviously, it couldn't be completed in a short period of time. After hundreds of millions of years, Luo Fan had just completely permeated all the patterns on the inner and outer walls of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. Of course, this was only the time inside the divine quartz heaven cauldron, although time wasn't an instant in the outside world. However, only a few days had passed. Compared to the hundreds of millions of years of time, it was really not considered a pseudo-saint-level existence. He could almost control and play with time as he pleased. He did not even need to think about speeding up time. As long as he had an instinctive inclination, he would be able to do it. After such a long time invading and permeating the many Daos that had turned into patterns, Luo Fan already felt that his connection with the great Tao and the divine quartz heaven cauldron had become extremely close. It was as if the great Tao and the divine quartz heaven cauldron had become his avatar and a part of him. Moreover, the boundless Tao contained within the grand Tao seemed to have become a part of his mind and memories at this moment. He didn't need to comprehend any of the profundities within it to be able to manipulate and use each and every one of them as he pleased. This feeling clearly allowed him to grasp almost all the false sane abilities that existed in the world, allowing him to truly possess omnipotent power. Everything that existed in the world, everything that could be done in the world, and everything that could be evolved in the world was now at his fingertips. There would no longer be any difficulty, and he didn't even need to go through any process. He didn't need to use any abilities or techniques to cast them. In fact, he didn't even need to use the false sane ability to achieve the power of the false sane ability. However, although this was already the case, this was only the first step of his mission. Although the divine quartz heaven cauldron and the great Tao had become an existence similar to his avatar, it was still just an avatar. Although it was troublesome to sever the connection between the avatar and the main body, there was still a way. However, he couldn't make the divine quartz heaven cauldron truly become an inseparable part of him. Obviously, he still needed to continue working hard. Luo Fan sensed the changes in his body, but he didn't hesitate at all. He once again devoted himself to working hard. His power began to seep into the material between the patterns on the inner and outer walls of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. The divine quartz heaven cauldron was an existence that completely reflected the great Tao, so its internal structure was naturally not condensed from any material. It, however, was an inexhaustible amount of laws and laws. The endless rules and laws were derived from the patterns on the surface. The number was billions of times more than the patterns on the surface. Among them, the rules and laws derived from each Tao were almost endless. They intertwined and affected each other. The complexity of the structure was already beyond the imagination of all living beings. All the rules and laws eventually connected into a whole, forming the material of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. They supported the countless Tao that existed on the surface of the divine quartz heaven cauldron. Such a material could support the countless Tao, so one could imagine how exclusive it was. The difficulty of trying to seep into it was many times more difficult than trying to seep into the lines on the surface, which was also known as the Tao. It seems that the flow of time is still not accelerated enough. Luo Fan had such a thought after looking at the material inside. Chapter 1504. Obviously, the false sages under the sages would soon summon the false sages under the sages. At that time, who knew what kind of battle would happen here and what kind of changes would occur? If he still did not complete his job in this upheaval and did not completely turn the divine court heaven cauldron into his body, he might not have such a chance at all. It was precisely because he knew this that Luo Fan accelerated the flow of time in the divine court heaven cauldron at an unprecedented speed, allowing him to obtain almost endless time to complete his infiltration of the divine court heaven cauldron. At this moment, the material of the divine court heaven cauldron beside Luo Fan was completely condensed from extremely complicated laws. Although its essence was lower than the Tao engraved on the inner and outer walls, it was billions of times more powerful than those Tao. Moreover, the integration was billions of times closer. They completely seemed to have perfectly materialized the power of those Tao. One could even find out what kind of laws a false sage Tao was made of, and one could know what kind of laws a false sage Tao could transform into, and what kind of laws it used to unleash its power. It was obviously more difficult to infiltrate such a material than infiltrate the patterns on the outside. However, this infiltration process was also a process of comprehending the false sage Taos and other Taos in a different way. During this process, he felt that his understanding of the various Taos was becoming deeper and deeper. In the past, perhaps he only knew it, but did not know why. He could use it, but he could not understand all the mysteries within. But now, as he infiltrated the laws, he gradually understood the mysteries of those Taos and gradually sensed the endless mysteries within those Taos. In the past, if he had lost this great Tao, it might have been completely impossible for him to use the mystiques transformed from these false sage Tao again. He might not even remember what it felt like to use these mystiques. He could only have a vague memory, and he could only vaguely feel that he seemed to have used these mystiques transformed from false sage Tao before. He could only vaguely feel that he seemed to have grasped such terrifying mystiques before. But now, as he infiltrated these laws, He gradually had the ability to leave this great Tao and use these false sage mystiques because he had already gradually comprehended the true profundities of these divine abilities and understood the principles behind the various forces and the circulation of laws and laws within these divine abilities. Of course, this didn't mean that the Grand Tao had become meaningless. On the contrary, the Great Tao was still extremely important. After all, he was not a false sage. If he left this Great Tao, although he could use the mysteries of the operation of the laws and the false saint's Great Tao to execute the false saint's Great Tao, he would need to go through a process. It would not be as convenient as executing the false saint's Great Tao. Instead, it required a method similar to simulation, through the construction of countless rules and laws to achieve the same effect. In that case, compared to the monolith saint's pseudo-sage mystical ability before he became a sage, his pseudo-sage mystical ability might be stronger and closer to the pseudo-sage mystical ability, but he still took a detour. Its power might be similar to that of a true false sage ability, but its speed would be extremely slow. For example, with the support of the Great Tao, he could execute a certain false sage divine ability with just a thought. However, if he lost the Great Tao, he might need to prepare for a few days before he could execute it. In that case, even if the effect of the divine ability he executed was no different from that of a true false sage mystical ability, its use in battle would be extremely minimal. In a battle between false sages, the exchange of false sage mystical abilities would be almost instantaneous. If he could only execute one after a few days, what was the point of fighting? Luo Fan did not think too much about this. At this moment, it was more important for him to completely refine the divine court heaven cauldron and turn the entire pseudo-chaotic origin spiritual treasure into his body. As for what would happen after he lost this Great Tao, it had nothing to do with him now. During this process, time flowed like flowing water. Unknowingly, trillions of years passed in the blink of an eye. Under the unimaginable flow of time in the divine court heaven cauldron, trillions of years were only a few hours compared to the outside world. Compared to the hundreds of millions of years that were equivalent to a few days, the acceleration of the flow of time had reached an unimaginable level. However, after spending trillions of years, Luo Fan still had not completed the entire process of infiltrating. His power had only penetrated more than half of the material. Moreover, when the amount of infiltration exceeded half, the difficulty of infiltration seemed to increase rapidly, and the speed of infiltration became slower and slower. According to his current calculations, it might even take hundreds of trillions of years to complete this process in the end. Even though Luo Fan had almost treated time as an attribute that was similar to space and could view the flow of time in a more detached manner, he could even directly transcend the flow of time in the divine court heaven cauldron and look at time from the perspective of the Earth's universe. He could not help but feel a headache at this moment. Hundreds of trillions of years. This step already requires so much time. What about the third step, which is to completely shatter the entire divine court heaven cauldron and integrate it into my body? That process is even more difficult than the second step. Luo Fan thought to himself with a bitter smile on his face. After smiling bitterly for a while, he calmed himself down and continued to use his power to infiltrate the material. Compared to the past, after trillions of years, the supreme and eternal aura on Luo Fan's body, which was originally brought about by the supreme authority, had unknowingly become so powerful that it was almost tangible. It seemed like it was no longer an external addition. It was no longer an external addition. Instead, it seemed to have burst forth from the source of his life. If an outsider saw Luo Fan at this moment, they would definitely not be able to tell that he was only a level 9 pseudo-saint. After comprehending the mysteries of the pseudo-saint Tao for such a long time, Luo Fan had already unknowingly crossed the limit and made a great breakthrough in his cultivation realm. He had crossed the limit of level 8 pseudo-saint and became a level 9 pseudo-saint. Instead, he was completely regarded as a real pseudo-saint perhaps. To be more precise, the current Luo Fan was actually a pseudo-saint. He could possess all the power of a pseudo-saint without the help of the supreme authority, and he could have the eternal indestructibility of a pseudo-saint. He was omnipotent. He was omniscient and omnipotent. He could use all the abilities of a pseudo-saint without the help of the supreme authority. Wasn't this a pseudo-saint? From this point of view, what Luo Fan was currently doing could clearly be considered a method to prove his Tao and become a saint. Moreover, it should be considered a method that was more mysterious than any other method to prove his Tao and become a saint. It was an even more exquisite method to become a saint. After all, after proving his Tao and becoming a saint, the shackles of heaven and earth would be smaller than other methods. He would not be destroyed because of the destruction of heaven and earth. Even after leaving heaven and earth, he would still be able to maintain a portion of the characteristics of a pseudo-saint. He would not fall from the 9 heavens into the mud because of this. Just as Luo Fan had expected, the subsequent process of infiltration became slower and slower. After hundreds of trillions of years, he had finally completely infiltrated the last bit of the material of the divine court heaven cauldron and completely comprehended all the mysteries of the laws within it. He had also engraved the inner and outer walls of the divine court heaven cauldron. He had also gained a deep understanding of the mysteries of the countless Tao patterns. If one were to look at his current actions from the perspective of proving his Tao and becoming a saint, it could be said that he had truly proven his Tao. He had truly become a pseudo-saint. The power of his mystical abilities and his powerful strength could also allow him to have the characteristics of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility around the great Tao. He also had the ability to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. He could also fight against all pseudo-saint mystical abilities and create all pseudo-saint mystical abilities from the looks of it. The huge amount of pseudo-saint mystical abilities that he had obtained from the Genesis Saint were no longer useful to him. After completing this step, Luo Fan let out a long breath and looked extremely relaxed. At this point, the divine court heaven cauldron could be said to be inseparable from him. If others wanted to take away the divine court heaven cauldron, it would only be possible if they completely destroyed him. Of course, although this made him a lot safer, it was clearly not enough to make him absolutely safe. If he wanted to be absolutely safe, unless he could complete the 3rd step and completely destroy the divine court heaven cauldron and refine it into his body. If that was the case, anyone who wanted to kill him would have to destroy him, the divine court heaven cauldron, and the great Tao at the same time. This was something that even a pseudo-saint could not do. Obviously, this also meant that he had obtained absolute safety. It's a pity that I'm still a little short. Luo Fan sighed and began to turn his gaze to the great Tao and the divine court heaven cauldron outside the great Tao. At this moment, the divine court heaven cauldron had been completely permeated by his power. All the changes, the circulation of the laws, and the transformation of all the power existed in his heart. They were closely connected to his mind and changed according to his mind. However, no matter how it changed, it was still the divine court heaven cauldron and maintained its original appearance. When Luo Fan wanted to completely absorb it into his body and fuse it with him, he could already feel an obstacle that seemed to be the most stable barrier in the world blocking in front of him, making it impossible for him to complete this process. After discovering this, Luo Fan knew that his martial arts were still insufficient. With a sigh, he began to slowly extract the endless laws within the divine court heaven and earth material that he had already mastered. He slowly pulled them over and absorbed them into his body. The law layer within the material was already an incomparably tight and complex entity. If he wanted to extract a part of it, it would be like directly challenging the whole thing. The number of things that needed to be considered was enough to make any supreme venerable's head explode. If it was not for the fact that Luo Fan had almost truly become a false saint at this moment, he might not even be able to find the starting point, let alone complete this process. Nevertheless, even if he could find the starting point now, it would obviously take an extremely long time to complete this process. For the first time, Guang extracted about 10 laws. However, it had already taken him nearly 100 years to complete it, The number of laws within the divine court heaven cauldron's material had almost surpassed the limit of numbers. It had reached a point where no number could clearly describe it. It would take 100 years to extract 10 laws. He had to completely absorb all the laws into his body. In other words, it was easy to imagine how much time it would take to completely absorb the divine court heaven cauldron's material into his body. It was almost impossible to imagine how long it would take. After discovering this, Luo Fan made a prompt decision. He directly unleashed the unimaginably powerful control of the divine court heaven cauldron that he had obtained after completing the first and second steps to its limit. It was almost impossible to accelerate the time inside the divine court heaven cauldron by countless times. If he still followed the previous flow of time, it might take decades or even centuries in the outside world to completely integrate the countless laws into his body. This was clearly not suitable. Time flew by, and billions of trillions of years had passed. Even in this world outside the divine court heaven cauldron, a full month had already passed. All of a sudden, on a certain day, the divine court heaven cauldron floating above the continent shook slightly. Then it suddenly collapsed and began to condense in the void in the blink of an eye. As the tiny fragments of the divine court heaven cauldron continued to condense, a man's figure gradually appeared. At this moment, this world no longer only had 6 continents like before. There were already more than 80 continents here. The starry sky in the sky had unknowingly become more complex than the starry sky of any other world, and it was even more dazzling. He looked up. The endless stars had already illuminated the entire world, making it as bright as day. There was no need for the sun or the moon in this world, since there was already sufficient light. Because of this change, compared to a month ago, the world was already billions and billions of times larger. At this moment, any of the major Kiliacosm worlds that could give birth to sages could not compare to the size of this world. As for the stability of time and space, this world was already stronger than Earth's universe, let alone other worlds of different levels. Among the many continents in this world, the largest was Hun Guzi's continent. Next was Luo Fan's continent, followed by Shitsi Feng's continent. The other 80 continents were about the same size, but they were much smaller than the 3 of them. Between these 80 continents was a vast and boundless ocean. These oceans were completely connected to the continents, and they could even be considered a part of the continents. They were clearly separated from each other, and the water did not flow at all. They were independent and relatively independent. Obviously, the ocean was also born because of the birth of these continents. In other words, it was also formed because of the false saints entering this world. On each of these continents, there was a false saint. However, not every false saint was like Hun Guzi and the rest who directly floated in the air. Some entered their magic treasures like Luo Fan, some directly built thrones in the void, and some even built cave abodes there. There were even a few false saints who only left their shadows there while they entered the continents themselves to modify them, allowing the continents to start evolving all kinds of living beings. However, they were able to vividly display their personalities and thoughts. Today was a similarly peaceful day. Many pseudo-sages were either cultivating, communicating, arguing, or playing as usual. Suddenly, such a change in the divine court heavenly cauldron instantly attracted the attention of all the false saints. He actually completely devoured the magic treasures. His methods are actually so profound. Everyone was a false saint, so how could anyone be less knowledgeable than others? However, all of them instantly saw through the changes that were happening here at this moment. For a moment, all of their emotions were different. Is he really not a disciple of a saint? A false saint who looked like an old man asked Hun Guzi. This false saint was also on Hun Guzi's side. Like Hun Guzi, he was also a disciple of the Primordial Lord of Heaven. His name was Tian Huangzi. Of course, if senior brother doesn't believe me, you can ask junior brother Jian Huangzi, Hun Guzi said with a smile. Tian Huangzi naturally would not really ask Jian Huangzi, so he let out a long sigh. I didn't expect there to be an expert among the rogue cultivators. This kind of determination, it's something that I can't compare to. As a fall saint, he naturally knew that it was not difficult to refine a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, but to completely shatter it and completely devour it into his body, or rather, transform into his own body. The difficulty was completely different. That would not only require an endless amount of energy, it would also take an endless amount of time. Even if he thought that he was the most patient among the many disciples of the saints, he did not have the courage to do so. At this moment, seeing that his choice of retreating in the face of difficulties was realized in the hands of others, one could imagine how complicated Tian Huangzi's feelings were. It was similar to Tian Huangzi's. The other false saints looked in that direction with complicated gazes. I didn't expect him to be able to do this back then. At this moment, Jing Yixi's eyes were flashing with interest. He muttered to himself. While all the sages were feeling emotional, the changes in the divine court heavenly cauldron had already stabilized. At this moment, the entire divine court heavenly cauldron had completely turned into smoke fragments and began to churn in the void. The image of the man's face became clearer and more realistic. During this process, the smoke fragments faintly emitted wisps of light that belonged to the great Tao. An eternal and indestructible aura gradually began to spread from it. After a short while, all the smoke condensed, and all traces of the heavenly cauldron's existence disappeared in an instant. What replaced it was a man. He did not give off any aura, but he naturally gave off the feeling that he was an incomparably perfect and noble man. This man was obviously Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes, which were faintly filled with endless wisdom. This kind of wisdom was even deeper and more vast than the wisdom in the eyes of any false saint he had seen before. However, compared to the other false saints, the indifference in the depths of his eyes was extremely faint, almost non-existent. It's finally completed. How many years has it been? Hundreds of trillions, thousands of trillions, tens of thousands of trillions, or hundreds of millions of trillions. He let out a long breath, and a faint smile appeared on his face as he thought to himself. Recalling the process of extracting the nomological laws and integrating them into his body, he felt inexplicably complicated. It was his first time doing something for such a long period of time. If not for the fact that he had the ability to transform his time perspective into the time dimension of the Earth's universe, he would not have been able to persevere no matter what. Such a long time was almost longer than all the time that all his clones, incarnations, and projections had experienced since he transmigrated through the primordial world, including the time that had passed after time acceleration. To persevere in such a boring matter for such a long time was not something that could be described simply by having firm willpower. This could be seen from the fact that many false saints had clearly thought of this method, but none of them had the courage to put it into practice. Of course, the other false saints did not dare to put it into practice because they could not view time in line with the time dimension of the Earth's universe like Luo Fan did. However, it did not mean that their willpower was inferior to Luo Fan's at this moment. Seeing that Luo Fan had returned to his senses, Hunguzi smiled and said, "Congratulations, fellow Taoist Luo Fan, for transcending the shackles." "It's just a small achievement," Luo Fan said with a smile. Chapter 1505. After a round of congratulations, Luo Fan naturally got to know all the false saints present. He also understood which saint the false saints present belonged to. At this time, although it had been a long time since Hun Guzi and the others had invited the false saints who were also disciples of the saints, they still did not summon all the false saints over. This was because many false saints under the saints did not want to get involved in this matter and were only willing to wait quietly at the side. In fact, in other words, they were the false saints who were on the same side as Jing Yitzi and did not care much about whether this matter would succeed or not. To them, what they wanted to do the most was naturally to cultivate quietly and wait quietly. As for this battle that would decide the course of action between the two camps and unify the two camps, what did it have to do with them? How could they be willing to get involved in this mess? Therefore, they pretended not to receive the spiritual light emitted by Hun Guzi and the others. They did not come here directly like the false saints in this world. The reason why they did not proceed with their original plan of inviting the saints to create a battlefield that only the victors could leave was also because they wanted to invite them here. Although the false saints were in the middle of the two camps and did not care about the outcome of this battle, who could guarantee that they would not change their minds at any time? For the false saints who had mastered the true saint mystiques, there was no need for a lot of them. As long as there was one who stood against the winning side, the outcome of this battle would become meaningless. The false saints who had mastered the true saint mystiques were enough to make all the false saints under the saints unable to move. They would make the situation exactly the same as it was now. There was no difference at all. It was precisely because they knew this that the false saints present knew that the false saints were not in their two camps and had no conflict with either camp. However, it was impossible for them to carry out the battle that they had to before they arrived. Although their people seemed to be here, they were not. Actually, their minds, a large portion of them, were transmitted through the spiritual light to communicate with the false saints who were unwilling to come here and persuade them to come. It had been said before that the will of the saints was extremely firm. It was almost impossible to change. This was the case for the false saints who stood in the opposing camps. Those don't express their opinions. The false saint, who did not show any inclination and did not care about the final outcome of the battle, was the same. They had already decided not to participate in this battle. It was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to make them change their minds and come here without entering this world. Therefore, even though there were so many pseudo-saints who had mastered true divine omniscient powers, and almost every pseudo-saint had mobilized their potential to invite them over, the progress was still rather slow. Not only had none of the false saints been summoned over, but battles between true saints had also begun to break out in various parts of the void and in the extremely wide range of the heavens and earths. It could be said that it would still take a long time before he could make any significant progress. After roughly understanding the current situation, Luo Fan sighed, knowing that he didn't need to be so anxious before. According to the current development of the situation, there were probably still a few years before the battle between the disciples of the saints would truly erupt. Based on the divine court Heavenly Cauldron's ability to accelerate time, he still had at least billions of trillions of years. With the accumulation of such time, even if he slowed down his speed by 10 times, it would still be more than enough for him to completely refine the divine court Heavenly Cauldron before the battle erupted. Of course, since he had already completed the refinement and completely shattered the divine court Heavenly Cauldron into his body, allowing his body to fuse with the complete Great Tao and become inseparable from then on, allowing him to forever maintain the false saint omniscient powers and false saint powers. Naturally, there was no need for him to feel any regret. After sighing with emotion for a while, he began to put this matter to the back of his mind and began to carefully experience the changes that had occurred to him after completely fusing the divine court Heavenly Cauldron into his body. At this moment, his perception of everything in the world had undergone an earth-shattering change. Even the chaotic state outside the world seemed to have become much clearer in his eyes. The various mysteries contained in the chaotic state seemed to have been unveiled in front of him, revealing its truth. In the past, when he looked at the chaotic state, he could only feel a sense of grayness. He could only know that it contained endless principles, endless mysteries, and endless power, but he couldn't distinguish what principles, what mysteries, and what power it was. If he wanted to understand the mysteries of the chaotic state, he could only do so through probing, attacking, and changing the chaotic state. But now, when he looked at the chaotic state, it was as if the fog had disappeared, and he could already see the principles, mysteries, and power. However, it was a pity that even though he had already seen all those things, his understanding of those principles, mysteries, and power still hadn't improved at all. In fact, on the contrary, because he could see it clearly, it made him more aware of the complexity of some principles, the profoundness of those mysteries, and the wonder of those powers. He naturally understood in his heart that it was impossible for him to comprehend, understand, or control all of this at the moment. On the contrary, unknowingly, It made him feel indescribable decadence and despair. In a trance, he felt that he would never be able to fully comprehend it, and that he couldn't walk freely in it. This was like an ordinary person who saw a complete stranger and didn't know how strong or weak he was. It wasn't strange at all if you wanted to challenge him. You would even imagine what would happen if you won, and how long it would take for you to win. However, if you knew that this person could crush you with a finger, would you still have the thought of challenging him? Would you really have delusions that you could win? Would you even think about how you would win? In the past, Luo Fan looked at the chaotic state. It was like an ordinary person looking at a complete stranger. Even if he knew that the opponent might be much stronger than him, he wouldn't despair. He would imagine how he would defeat the opponent. He would imagine what he would gain after defeating the opponent, what kind of performance he would have. But now, after seeing the chaotic state clearly, he was like an ordinary person who could clearly see all the abilities of an immortal. It was as if he knew what an immortal could do. Under such circumstances, how could he still think that he could defeat the opponent? How could he not feel this inexplicable despair? Is this the chaotic state in the eyes of the fake sage? No wonder there aren't any false saints who spend their efforts to comprehend the chaotic state in order to turn the false into the real. Instead, they all have their eyes on the opportunity in this Earth universe. Luo Fan instantly had such a thought. With this thought in mind, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Fortunately, I know the key. Otherwise, becoming a fake sage might have really cut off my path to becoming a sage. He felt an indescribable sense of relief. After completely integrating the pseudo-chaos spiritual treasure Heavenly Court cauldron into his body, although Luo Fan didn't have such an expectation, he had actually completed the process of a normal cultivator becoming a fake sage. He had raised his life essence to the essence of a sage, or rather, the essence of a fake sage, allowing him to truly become a fake sage. It was precisely because of this improvement that he obtained a perspective that he couldn't obtain when he obtained the supreme authority of a certain world. It allowed him to have an ability that he had never had before, allowing him to easily see the true chaotic state. If he hadn't been extremely firm on the path to becoming a true sage, the despair he felt when he saw the chaotic state at this moment would have been enough to scatter all his spirit and crush all his initiative. It would have planted in his heart the thought that the chaotic state was invincible and that it was impossible for him to walk freely in it. This thought might be extremely weak, but it was definitely fatal to the path to becoming a true sage. A true sage was a supreme existence that could walk freely in the chaotic state, come and go freely, and could open up a perfect world at will. How could such an existence leave any flaws in his heart? Although this subtle thought was subtle, it was already a flaw, and it was enough to make it impossible for him to become a true sage forever with this thought in mind. Luo Fan looked around and saw the gazes of many fake sages. In an instant, he comprehended more things that he had never comprehended before. The indifference in the depths of the fake sage's eyes was not completely indifference to those who had yet to become fake sages, but indifference to everything. It was even indifference to themselves. This kind of indifference could only be born from the deepest despair. It was born from the despair of realizing that all their paths had been completely cut off. It was indifference to everything. After seeing the source of this indifference, Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh. He realized that he suddenly couldn't feel any respect for these fake sages. Instead, he only felt an inexplicable sympathy for them. These are just walking corpses. Those fake sages who want to fight with all their might and fuse all the pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures to create a world in order to obtain the opportunity to turn the fake into the real have fused all their courage and determination to carry out their final struggle. As for those who oppose it, they are already in complete despair and have truly accepted the fact that they can't become true sages. They regard fake sages as their final destination. In his heart, he instantly redefined the nature of the two camps of over 80 fake sages in front of him. From this definition, he clearly agreed with those fake sages who were fighting with all their might. towards those fake sages who had completely accepted their fate and felt that fake sages were their final destination. He clearly knew that they were right and wise. He knew his limits, but he did not agree with their mentality. This mentality might be correct, but it was not the mentality of true cultivation. Even if the probability of success was only 1 in a trillion, true cultivators had to spend billions of times more effort to pursue, search, and work hard. It was just like Tao validation and becoming a sage. Ordinary cultivators would succeed. What were the chances of becoming a true sage? It might not even be 1 in a trillion. However, in the endless world, how many cultivators had worked hard for the goal of Tao validation and becoming a sage? Since ancient times, how many cultivators had worked hard? All of their lives have been wasted on this path. All of them have been wasted on this path. For the final slim chance of success, they had exhausted all of their efforts, all of their energy, and even their entire lives. Now, these fake sages had clearly reached the final step and were countless steps ahead of the countless cultivators in the countless worlds and boundless worlds. However, they had put down their efforts at this moment and retreated at the final step. Even if there were thousands of reasons and tens of thousands of reasons, Luo Fan would never agree with this. Luo Fan sensed his inner thoughts, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. He finally understood why the war between the fake sages did not really have anything to do with him. No matter which side won or lost, it would not really affect him. However, he had only thought about it for a while and had already gotten involved. He was even standing directly in the battlefield between the sects of the sages. All of this was clearly because he had already agreed with the pursuit of those fake sages to turn the fake into the real. In his heart, he was already looking forward to them being able to turn the fake into the real. After understanding his inner thoughts, Luo Fan suddenly felt as if he had obtained something and comprehended something. This kind of gain and epiphany was extremely small, so small that it could not even be summarized in words. However, this small gain had already made him feel that his control over the true sage mystique seemed to have strengthened a lot. Vaguely, he actually felt that he seemed to be able to control the karma net that he had used to fight against Han Guzi's true sage mystique and leave the battlefield of Han Guzi's true sage mystique. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved lightly. In an instant, in the depths of the void, in a world that had turned into a flying sword, the treasure light that belonged to the true sage mystique that had been shining for a long time instantly faded. Next, a net of karma shot out of the world, and with a tremor, it disappeared without a trace. At this moment, this flying sword had already surrounded dozens of worlds. Among them, there were more than 6 fake sages in each world. Similarly, there were also more than 6 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth. These worlds and these fake sages had previously surrounded this flying sword, but did not attack it. They had used their powerful power to suppress and deter the world, as if they wanted to use this method to force the fake sages in this world to do something. At this moment, the layers of true sage treasure light that had enveloped the surroundings suddenly disappeared completely. Following that, a strange net broke away from the world and stepped into the void, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. This change instantly stunned the many worlds and even more fake sages among them. While they were stunned, the voice of the Genesis sage came from the flying sword. Fellow Taoists, the 2 true sage mystiques have disappeared. I hope that everyone can open the way. There was no frustration in this voice. It was still as calm as before, as if nothing had happened. After Luo Fan left this world, the time in this world had been adjusted by the Genesis sage and the others for billions of years. After such a long time, the Genesis sage and the other 19 sages had already conducted the most detailed research they could on the 2 true sage mystiques inside the major Kiliacosm. Although this kind of research did not yield much in essence, it was already the limit of what they could do. At this time, the 2 true sage mystiques had already become useless. Although they were extremely precious, they were no longer of much use to them. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan suddenly regained control of his karma net and recalled it, causing the other true sage mystique to gradually disappear due to the loss of its opponent. To the many fake sages, this was not too regretful, nor would they feel that they had suffered a loss. At this moment, the Genesis sage was not forcing himself to speak with such an attitude. It was not forcefully suppressing it with the temperament of a sage, but his true attitude and true thoughts. If it was an ordinary matter, the surrounding fake sages might have directly believed him and made way. However, it was clear that this was no longer a trivial matter. It was related to whether they could turn the false into the real, and whether they could continue on their path of cultivation that spanned billions of trillions of years. Even if they knew that there was a 99% chance that the Saint of Genesis was telling the truth, it was meaningless for them to continue surrounding the flying sword. However, they could not let go of the remaining 0.1% chance. At this moment, not only did they not make way, but they also began to display their might, activating the power of the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. In an instant, countless rays of spiritual light pounced towards the flying sword. They wanted to directly destroy the flying sword, or rather, the defense of this world. They wanted to force the Genesis sage to hand over what they were looking for. Facing such an attack, the Genesis sage and the other 19 fake sages who had already lost their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth should have been unable to resist. However, after comprehending the two true divine theurgy for billions of years, although they did not comprehend what they wanted, they were still able to comprehend it. The key to turning the fake into the real was to turn the fake into the real, but there were also many gains. At this moment, facing the attacks of the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, the power of the 19 fake sages communicated. Then, under the control of the Genesis sage, an inexplicable change occurred. During this change, all the power gathered into a ray of spiritual light and suddenly rushed out from the tip of the flying sword. It turned into a large net in the void and suddenly wrapped around it. Every time it came into contact with the spiritual light emitted by the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, a portion of it would naturally split up and fight with that ray of spiritual light. In this way, when this big net swept over, the spiritual light emitted by each pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was entangled with a small net that was tangible but insubstantial, but powerful beyond imagination. Moreover, every small net seemed to be wholeheartedly controlled and commanded by a pseudo-saint. They actually gradually gained the upper hand when dealing with the spiritual light emitted by every pseudo-primordial chaos numinous treasure. From the looks of it, it seemed like it was gradually turning into a victory and wiping out all the spiritual lights. Seeing such a change, the fake sages who were besieging them were shocked. Such a method was already close to a true sage mystique. At this moment, they did not dare to be negligent. They instantly activated the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and channeled their power into the spiritual lights they emitted, greatly increasing the power of the spiritual lights in the process. The power of the spiritual lights was also greatly supported. In the end, they slowly turned the tables. After an unknown period of time, they barely shattered the nets one by one, preventing the spiritual lights they emitted from being sealed by the net. It also prevented their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures from being easily snatched away like a real, true sage mystique. At this point, the fake sages heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it's not a true sage mystique. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll be in trouble this time. Every false saint had similar thoughts in their minds. However, at this moment, when they calmed down and took a look, they realized that the flying sword had already left their encirclement. It had already left a distance that they could not catch up to no matter how hard they chased after it. It was not because it was so far that they could not cross it, but because it was so far that they could not catch up with the speed of the flying sword with their speed. The fake sages watched the flying sword slowly escape from afar, and none of them spoke. Not to mention that they could not catch up to it now, Even if they could, they probably would not dare to chase after it again. Although the fake sages and the flying sword did not obtain the true sage mystique because they had comprehended the battle process of the two true sage mystiques, the mystique that they had comprehended from the two true sage mystiques, the mystique that could only be performed by the combined forces of the sages, had already surpassed the limit of the fake sage mystique. Even if it was not a true sage mystique, it was already not something that they could resist. It would be fine if they could not catch up to it. Even if they did, they would only be tortured. It was impossible for them to achieve what they wanted to achieve.